511. Arthur Leywin. Cassius turned his back on the great wound in the sky, his eyes flashing like lightning as they swept across the other great lords and myself. "Come," was all he said before his ether started to wrap around all of us. I felt myself being dragged away and looked down at Ellie. Gritting my teeth, I resisted Cassius's pull. "What are you doing?" He scowled as ether flexed around us, visibly warping the air. "There is no time, Arthur." I held his eyes for just a second. Myre shifted, resting her hand on Cassius's shoulder. The other great lords all turned to me, Radix frowning, Morwena scowling, and both Rye and Novus looking pale and sick. Regis leapt into me, while Sylvie pulled Ellie back a half step and nodded. I let go, and space folded around me. We appeared in a courtyard amid low, carved walls of white stone. Ivy-wrapped pillars rose from the ground, growing progressively taller as they marched toward what must have once been an arch of matching stonework. Now, though, broken pieces of the arch were spread out in a sort of halo, floating in the air. Inside that halo, space itself was distorted, tearing as it opened out into the huge wound in the sky. The tear itself shimmered with an oil slick of colors, like reflections off the surface of a bubble. The aurora effect was stronger here, staining the sky around the tear like blood seeping out from a scrape. The other great lords were already moving. Dozens of asuras, mostly dragons, formed a half circle around the two broken stubs that marked where the arch had been. Everyone else quickly found space in the circle, and with Realmheart active, I could not only feel, but also see the mana particles of their spells move around the tear. They were trying to hold it together. A few of the dragons worked etheric spells alongside their brethren's mana-based magic, their spatium arts serving as a more powerful component in manipulating the torn space. When the great lords joined them, the slow growth of the wound suddenly halted, but the wound itself still shivered in the sky, an apocalyptic slash stretching from one edge of Epheotus to the other. Regis drifted out of me in wisp form and floated toward the wound. I sensed the point when it grabbed and attempted to pull him through. There, barely holding it in check, he sent back to me, his form flickering like a gas lamp in a hot wind. The pressure is incredible, enough to slurp all of Epheotus right through. With some difficulty, he reversed course, flying down beside me and manifesting his physical shape as a large wolf maned with purple fire. Through Regis, I had felt something. The torn space wasn't Epheotus, but it wasn't the world of Decathan or Alakria either, it wasn't the real, physical space of the world. It was the barrier that separated the physical world from anything else. Everything else. The etheric realm, non-physical space, whatever else was out there, the dimension that Epheotus was safely cocooned within, neither fully inside nor outside of the world as we knew it. It was a border, barrier, and transition all at once. As it ripped wide, Epheotus would be squeezed back into that physical space, with catastrophic consequences for both worlds. Layers of insight pressed against one another in my mind. What I was seeing was both destruction and correction. When Epheotus was expelled and the bubble containing it had collapsed entirely, the wound would seal back over as if it had never existed, much like what fate expected for the etheric realm. I stepped forward, passing through the half-circle of asuras until I stood right before the shattered feet of the archway. As I got closer, gravity shifted until the force pressing down on me, and the force pulling me toward the wound, were equal. Another step, and the rift would start dragging me through. My name sounded from behind, Cassius's voice, but King's Gambit was slipping away and my concentration fracturing, the dozens of simultaneously held thoughts splintering off and breaking away, like branches too laden with wet heavy snow. One single bright thought kept the hangover fatigue back like a bright light in fog. Core, ether channels, and the pure physical force of my pseudo-Asuran physique all worked together automatically. Bright streams of the amethyst particles wound through me, down my spine, my new godrune, pure, distilled insight both brand new and utterly familiar, sparked to life against my back. The shape of the world changed within the lens of my perspective. Not in the way Realmheart aligned my focus so I could see mana particles, or Godstep revealed the etheric pathways, or even in the way King's Gambit opened my mind up to so many different possibilities. These, in comparison, were so small, so narrowly focused. Now, I felt connected, broadened. I felt the space around me, how it had been molded and expanded. Epheotus was far too much world compressed into far too small an atmosphere. The Asuras' homeland didn't exist simply in a physically bound space, as the world of Decathan and Alakria, or even my old world of Earth, did. Throughout its eons of history, Epheotus had continued to grow, constantly making more room for the expansion of Asuran civilization. And yet Epheotus did not hold the crux of my attention. The wound in space was bright and clear and horrible when viewed from my new perspective. The God rune didn't change my physical sight, light didn't bend any differently, no new dimension within three-dimensional space was revealed. It was more like how my core gave me a sixth sense about ether. I felt the way space unfolded around me, and I knew, because I had to, because the insight that had allowed me to learn the God rune both ensnared and included knowledge of the God rune itself, that I could touch the space, and that I could mold it. My hands rose, more a ritual than physical necessity, and my mental fingers began to feel for the edges of the tear. The visual manifestations of distorted light that made the tear visible to the naked eye rippled as space itself was reshaped. Slowly, as I grew more confident, I began to pull the edges inward, smoothing them out and willing the spatial barrier closed. Distantly, although I was unable to process the meaning of their words, I began to hear noises from the Asuras. Gasps, pleas, shapeless words in encouraging tones. Then, space snagged. The pressure created by the wound, the force that was pulling Ephiodus into my world, was too great to pull the wound's edges fully back together. Changing tactics, I began to fold space along the tattered edges of the wound. The folds gripped the wound itself, holding it in place like staples in parchment. The space around the tear trembled, but the pressure was taken off the Asuras currently fighting to prevent its continued expansion. At least for the moment. As soon as I accomplished this, I began to lose my hold over the God rune. The conceptualization of space in this way was alien, and holding the varied and competing insights in my mind was exhausting. I could already feel the tension of fatigue behind my eyes like a building headache. I sagged slightly as the God rune dimmed. From behind me, a stern voice said, "What did you just do?" I turned to meet Cassius's gaze, his eyes shining like two blood-stained garnets as they reflected the scarlet aurora. "Bought us time, but I don't know how long it's going to last." "No, Arthur." He took a step forward, and the world of Ephiodus seemed to shift forward with him, contracting toward me. "What did you just do? How?" He couldn't stop his focus from slipping upward, drawn into the gravity of the torn sky like Ephiodus itself was at risk of doing. "You've been withholding things from me." I felt my brows lifting, my expression one of disillusioned astonishment. "Your world is collapsing in front of your very eyes and that's the first thing you have to say." I shook my head, a wry, disappointed smirk curling one corner of my lips. "I've only just gained new insight that formed a God rune on our great hunt. I can sense and, in some ways, directly manipulate space. I've barely had the time to fully test my limits with it yet, and I can't close the tear completely. Eventually, those folds in space will rip free, and the hole will start growing again." I did not try to keep the harshness from my tone. Cassius, to my surprise, did not react. Instead, he turned toward the others. "Focus all your efforts around those points in space, where the edges of the rift seem to pinch together. Buttress these points, and we may extend for ourselves the time Lord Arthur has bought for us." With the orders given, he turned and began to walk away. There was something in his body language that clearly expressed an expectation that I follow, just as the other great lords did. I considered simply not following as the other great lords fell into line behind Cassius. There was an incredible weight pressing in behind my eyes, and I wanted nothing more than to return to my family, lie and tell them everything would be okay, then close my eyes for a few hours. Instead, with a sigh, I began following after the others. "Old Man Dragon is looking a little punch-drunk," Regis noted as he kept pace at my side. "Agrona seems to have won this one, if I'm being honest." "Let's hope not," I shot back, although I was no more capable of lying to Regis than to myself in that moment. Once we were well away from the Asuras helping to bind the wound, Cassius came to a stop. When he spoke, his voice churned through the air as if resounding off the distant mountain peaks, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, a blistering heat that rose up from the cold white stone of the wide courtyard floor. "Lord Lewin, you must return to Alakria immediately." A second's pause, the bare flicker of hesitation, then, "I am tasking you with killing Agrona Vritra." As the other lords listened to Cassius, they each looked in a different direction. Morwena stared at me, while Radix's flint-hard eyes drilled into Cassius. Raikathan watched the sky, peering into the wound as if he could see all the way to the heart of Tagrin Kylum, where Agrona was no doubt frothing with glee at his success. Novus, on the other hand, turned away from the wound, gazing toward the horizon and flickering with mana. I rolled a response around in my mouth for several seconds before speaking it aloud. "Shouldn't we focus on your people first? We have to start evacuating Ephiodus." "Nonsense," Morwena snapped, nostrils flaring with a sound like rustling leaves. We absolutely will not let a single rogue basilisk bring down our entire world. Radix turned on her with the speed of a silver panther, his own much deeper voice vibrating across hers without effort. And yet it seems as if he has done just that. With each word, the Titan Lord appeared to grow by several inches. Scrape the bark from your eyes, Lady Mapelia. We have all been blind to the true intent of Agrona's rebellion, Rai said, his tone placating. Now our eyes are open. A shiver ran through Novus, and flames danced along his skin and over his clothes. Are they though? He turned and stabbed one finger toward the wound. What in all the blazing fires of the abyss could Agrona's intent be with that? I stepped forward into the middle of the Asuran lords, each of their cataclysmic power only barely contained. It's pretty obvious. All 5 great lords shifted their attention back to me, their faces expressing varying levels of incredulity. Only Cassius looked as if he understood what I was getting at. We don't have time for this, Cassius said, cutting off any further discussion. Lords, we will not allow our people to lose hope in Ephiodus, or faith in us. Collect those most trusted by your clans and communities, and return to my castle within the hour. I will make a statement. For a moment, no one moved. Go, he snapped. Morwena jumped as if she'd been slapped. Stone cracked as a tree suddenly began to erupt from the ground, its silver trunk extending up over our heads and then branching out and spawning golden leaves. She gave Cassius a stiff bow, then spun and walked into the tree, which opened up to accept her passage. The moment she was gone, the golden leaves began to fall, and the silver bark sloughed off to reveal swiftly rotting wood. In moments, only a bed of leaves remained around our feet, and the entire tree was gone. In the meantime, Radix had sunk into the ground, vanishing just as completely if less spectacularly. Novus leapt into the air, and his body swelled out into an enormous, avian form covered in feathers the color of fire and ash. He sped away with incredible speed, passing out of sight in just a few seconds. Only Rai, Lord of Great Clan Cawthon, remained. He cleared his throat. No basilisk yet alive will side with Agrona. He doesn't represent us, Lord Indrath. You can be certain of that. Cassius sneered. Is Vritra blood really so different from Cawthon blood? Rai winced, but the exact nature of his expression was difficult to parse. He gave a perfunctory bow, then turned and took a step forward. A black whirlwind sprang up from the stones, engulfed him, and then dissipated. The basilisk lord was gone. We should both go, I said, watching the last of the golden leaves tossed around by the fading whirlwind. Gather your best warriors. We will destroy Agrona together. No. A single word, no thought, not an instant of hesitation. Utterly without room for argument. I scoffed and threw my hands in the air. Even now, Cassius turned his back on me and strode farther away from the Asuras who were still working to prevent the wound from widening. I pressed my palms into my eyes as if I could push down the rising pressure in my skull, then begrudgingly followed. Ether eased down and into the King's Gambit Godrune, and I felt my consciousness explode outward into dozens of different branches, threads, and layers. Good, Cassius said wryly. Perhaps with your ether art active, you will be able to understand what I'm about to tell you. I didn't have to bite back a retort, as the cold logic of having so many overlapping thought processes took no offense at his sniping. By all means, enlighten me. Cassius did not stop marching forward, nor did he turn around to speak to me. He wove through an increasing density of ivy-covered half-walls, around little burbling fountains, and under archways of tangled vines and white stone. Twice, I've struck directly at Agrona. The first attempt was shortly after he fled Ephiodus. When my daughter went after him, Cassius let out a huffing breath, his shoulders rising and falling in a sharp motion. The entire Vritra clan followed him, as well as members of other basilisk clans as well, and even a few non-basilisk Asuras. You've explained this before, I noted, wondering if he was trying to distract me. Of course, he said, sounding unexpectedly tired. The battle tore the continent apart, nearly splitting it in two and resulting in the formation of a new sea and mountain range. The attack was meant to be decisive. I sent even more loyal Asuran soldiers than I knew was prudent. One thread of my conscious mind caught on his phrasing. What does he mean by prudent? Despite killing many of his followers, and many more of his Alacrians, the forces that reached his fortress, Tegrin Kylum, simply vanished. When, many centuries later, I tasked Aldir with assassinating Agrona and thus ending the war between your two continents immediately, half of his team was snapped out of existence in a moment. Neither event provided us with a clear picture of what Agrona had done, or how. In both events, we were forced to retreat from your world. The part of me listening and digesting his words fractured into several simultaneous and competing trains of thought. I stopped walking and sat down atop one of the half walls, my arms crossed. Cassius marched forward for another 10 feet or so before stopping and turning to look at me. Cassius had been careful in his explanation of what Agrona wanted, back when I confronted him after fighting the wraiths for Oludari. He wove his lies with truth, and hid both within story and legend. But throughout these conversations, Cassius had let slip a few details that now seemed very telling. Instead of fighting a cataclysmic war, regardless of our ability to win, I sent assassins, as many and as powerful as I could risk. The attack was meant to be decisive. I sent even more loyal Asuran soldiers than I knew was prudent. Even during the dragon's brief watch in Decathan, Cassius had sent so few soldiers, and mostly young and of limited power. Something scares you more than Agrona. The words came out flat, a simple statement of fact. I think it's time to tell me the real reason why you're afraid to leave Ephiodus. A muscle in Cassius's face twitched, and for a moment, for the first time since I'd known him, he looked old. Wrinkles did not suddenly spread across his face like cracked desert clay, but his spirit itself seemed to suddenly flag, like a sprinter reaching the end of their endurance. His power retracted into him. His eyelids fluttered and his lips paled as they pressed into a thin line. It was so fast and so subtle I doubted I'd have noticed if not for King's Gambit. Then he swallowed, and it was as if the fatigue I'd seen had never existed at all, and I had to wonder for a second if I'd imagined it entirely. Power is like a beacon, Arthur. It shines far and wide, drawing attention from those who would challenge it, bow to it, beg and scrape and plead of it, or even those who would forcefully take it as their own. A pause, then, you yourself are from 2 worlds. You know that more types of magic than just mana and ether exist. As I said before, everything I've done has been to keep this world alive, as there are far worse things than the Vritra out in the darkness. As he said this last, his gaze shifted to the wound. My own followed, and together we looked into the darkness around the blue, green, and brown surface of my world. All the many disparate threads of my conscious mind slammed together. I'd never had any reason to consider other worlds beyond Earth and my new home. The fact that there would be other planets populated with different beings who utilized magic not born of mana, ether, or ki seemed obvious in the face of Cassius's statement, and yet I had entirely failed to consider it. My King's Gambit enhanced mind raced toward a dozen simultaneous considerations. I opened my mouth to try and ask a dozen questions at once but cut myself off. Cassius took the opportunity to keep speaking. Listen to me, Arthur. This part, the safety of all Asuran kind, is my burden to bear. Ephiodus, the world, its place inside the greater cosmos. All the things you blame me for, my burden, do you understand? Right now, no matter how your wheels might spin, you need to focus on a single essential reality, finding and destroying Agrona Vritra is your task. I do not fully understand why, but I believe you have become what you were exactly so that you can now defeat Agrona. Whatever power has stymied the Asuras who have gone to face him, perhaps you can counter. My jaw worked silently as I filtered through a dozen responses for the right one. I thought of the memories of Say Aram and the fall of the Jinn, of the rage felt by the second Jinn projection toward the dragons, at the images of one civilization after another falling. I thought of fate's explanation of the Etheric realm, and how it was unnaturally bound. Each of these events opened up before King's Gambit like pages in a book, their lessons and themes splitting through my mind as I fit them into this new explanation Cassius had offered. I saw no signs that he was being dishonest. He did not fidget or grow restless. There was no quickening of his pulse or shifting of his eyes. But he was an ageless Asura, and I had seen firsthand how he acted when in control, and when that control slipped. I couldn't recall a time when he was as direct or open with me as he seemed now. You can acknowledge his words but think for yourself, princess. Even his truths are used to manipulate, Regis, who had been quiet and retracted due to King's Gambit, thought tentatively. I could have smiled. At that moment, Regis and I weren't completely in line. He wasn't experiencing the bulk of my thoughts, as neither Regis nor Sylvie could make sense of the aggregate processes powered by King's Gambit. I could have smiled because I realized what needed to happen. Much could be forgiven, especially if the offender was repentant and willing to change. I understand, Cassius, I said at last. Thank you for being honest with me. Cassius's brows pinched together a fraction of an inch as I repeated those words, but he didn't otherwise acknowledge that he recognized them. I will find Agrona, and I will end him once and for all. I looked at the wound and thought, and then I will have to find some way to deal with that. Aloud, though, I continued. Should I leave immediately, or would you like me to stay for this pronouncement of yours? Either way, I need to gather my clan. Cassius crossed his arms and tapped a finger on his chin. It would be good for you to be there. It is unlikely an hour or two will make the difference regarding the survival of either world, but the presence of all 9 great lords will certainly help to give our people a sense of ongoing stability. I raised a brow and fidgeted with a vine of ivy. All of us. Cassius gave me a wry look. Yes, yes. We can't afford this discord between Ademir and myself to continue. I have no doubt even such a stubborn pantheon as him will be willing to lay aside his rage for a moment, considering what faces us. I put on a smile and slid down from the wall. Let's get moving then, unless there's anything else. Cassius hesitated. Before we return, he chuckled, an airy sound, just barely audible. Arthur, thank you. Your actions earlier, against Cairnos, and your efforts here with this wound. His eyes, settled now into an angry, bruised purple color, jumped to the sky behind me. I know you haven't entirely been able to put your faith in my intentions, but you have been able to see past our differences and work at my side. He straightened and raised his chin. I'm not blind to the fact that I owe you. Trust that I will return this favor in time. There may be things I have purposefully kept from you over the years, but Agrona's tearing the veil between worlds may very well have undone millennia of effort to ensure the continued safety of both your world and mine. Everything will come clear in time. So, he said, raising a hand, brushing it through the air like pushing aside a curtain. I felt his power move through me and realized he was attempting to break the binding he'd placed on me to enforce our exchange of information for protection of Decathan. Belatedly, I released the ether I had bound to imitate his spell, having already broken it myself. Cassius blinked, outwardly bemused, then let out a single, genuine laugh. But of course you did. He rolled his eyes. Never mind. Come, Arthur. Despite the challenges ahead, for you and I, at least, I believe this is a new beginning. He turned and space began to fold in front of him as his teleportation ability drew us back to Indrath Castle. In the last moments before the spell took me, I let my expression fall, my gaze cold and sharp against his back. 512. Arthur Leywin. It was a strange sensation, walking back into Indrath's Grand Hall. I had only just left it, and yet the entire landscape of both worlds had changed in the space of an hour. We had not only failed to capture Agrona, but he had struck back, tearing open the rift that connected Ephiodus's pocket dimension to the physical world. Although my new Godrune was no longer active, I could still feel the wound in the sky outside like the pressure of an oncoming storm. The Grand Hall was already beginning to refill. From the looks of it, some people hadn't even left yet, while others had hurried back after the wound appeared. Sylvie, knowing I was coming, had brought my mother and sister to stand near the door and wait. Chul lingered nearby with some of the phoenixes who'd already arrived. He flashed me a grin, but his gaze quickly slipped back to Neja of Ignis, daughter of Novus. I've kept them up to date on everything you've done, as much as I could, Sylvie thought as I entered the cavernous chamber. Mom hurried over to me. Instead of wrapping me in a hug, she let her forehead droop against my chest, then lightly struck my shoulder with a weakly held fist. Why oh why do you have to be at the center of everything, Arthur? I couldn't bring myself to smile, but I gave her a wan, tight-lipped expression that was reminiscent of one. I am the center of the universe, Mom. She let out a choked, humorless laugh, then she did wrap her arms around me. What are you going to do? Over the top of her head, I watched Morosaurus spill in. Those from far-off clan homes who hadn't attended the earlier celebration were beginning to arrive, trickling in alongside dragons and guests who'd been elsewhere in the castle. Viria of the Inthera clan was among them. She quickly scanned the hall and caught my eye. Biting her lip in a frown, she nodded, then was swept away in the incoming crowd. I have to find Agrona, I said softly. Mom took a step back while Ellie stepped forward. What? They said simultaneously. I rested a hand on each of their shoulders. It was always going to come down to this, but I need you here. I leaned in and lowered my voice. There's no turning back from what's happening out there. I've made some strides here, especially with the younger Asaurus, but I focused on Ellie, and she met my gaze unflinchingly. I just didn't have enough time. You're going to have to continue what I started. You two now represent every human, elf, dwarf, and alacrian on that world. I pointed up through the ceiling to where I could feel the wound struggling against the space I'd folded. Okay. Mom pulled Ellie close to her side, unable to keep the terror from her face. Ellie, though a bit pale, kept her expression stoic. Her lip pursed, and she gave me a single, serious nod. From the corner of my eye, I saw Varun storm into the grand hall with Zelena right behind him. The ancient Leviathan moved with a speed and purpose I hadn't seen from him before. Is it true? He said, stopping in front of me and breathing heavily. About Agrona and Kernos Vritra. The pearl. He gripped my shoulder with a surprising strength for one so visually decrepit. Is it true, Arthur? I looked around before answering, identifying multiple Asuras who were paying too close attention to us. It is, I answered, my voice soft but strained. To my surprise, Varun nodded, his milky eyes darting back and forth rapidly. His hand fell to his side, and he breathed easier. What? Before the word had fully formed, the lights in the great hall flared white, and Cassius appeared before his throne. The room was now packed with Asuras, and I saw that all of the great lords had arrived, even Ademir Thyestes. Cordry was there as well. The muscular, four-eyed Pantheon was careful to keep equidistant between his clan lord and Lord Indrath, who he served directly as a combat instructor. Without my realizing it, the grand hall had grown very loud, but the noise abated when the shifting of the light. Cassius did not waste any time. He took 2 steps down from the plinth occupied by his throne. Meyer stood to the side, and she stepped gracefully in and slipped her arm through Cassius's. Together, they took a single additional step forward, and the bright white lighting dimmed, leaving them in a spotlight that stood out against the rest of the hall. Gathered people of Epheotis, there is no need for me to explain why this meeting has been called, Cassius began. Each of you has seen the great wound in the sky, and by now, most of you will also have heard that it resulted as a direct attack by Agrona Vritra. Even Cassius's presence couldn't hold back the swell of fear and frustration that met these words. Please, Lord Indrath, tell us what we must do to stop Epheotis from bleeding out through the wound. Here when we should be preparing for. So what are you going to do? Silence. The word resounded from the walls and echoed back on itself several times over. But it was Lord Thyestes, not Cassius, who stepped forward, glaring around at the gathered Asuras. Our world is bleeding out, and you, representatives of our supposedly great clans, cluck like wyvern chicks and beg of your lord. What is he going to do? Ademir sucked his teeth, an uncomfortably violent sound coming from him. What are you going to do, brethren? What are you doing here, right now? Suddenly the Pathian spun on Cassius. For why have you brought us all together, Indrath? Why are we here instead of out there, fighting to close the wound in the sky, or if necessary preparing to flee our homes? Cassius met Ademir's eyes, and the force of their opposed personalities was palpable. Beside me, Ellie flinched and took a step away. I steadied her with a hand on her back. We are all here, Meyer began, smoothly pulling attention away from the stare-off happening in front of us, exactly so we do not succumb to fear and doubt. She smiled, her youthful face radiant. Agrona has long made it difficult and dangerous for us to pursue him, but as most of you know, our extended family among the Asura has grown one race larger. Most of the hall's occupants turn to glance at me or my companions, my clan, giving us varying levels of hopeful, fearful, or confused looks. When Meyer continued to speak, though, all attention was drawn back to her. Great Lord Arthur Lewin of the Archon race represents a new and better hope to ensure justice for this grotesque assault enacted by Agrona of the banished clan Vritra. Yes, my brother in vengeance. Chul's voice rang out, crashing through the silence like an avalanche. Cassius continued without acknowledging Chul's interruption. And while he returns to the world of his origin, rest assured that the Indrath clan will be working diligently to ensure the wound is closed. You're sending a human after Agrona Vritra? Someone asked, the speaker lost in the crowd. No, Cassius said, his voice subsuming the others that began mumbling throughout the hall. We're sending an archon to deal with Agrona Vritra. Lord Arthur has spent much of his life combating Agrona's efforts against the people of his world, safeguarding Epheotis from afar, and he is uniquely suited to ensure justice is done. As for us, forgive me, Lord and Lady, Lord Thyestes interrupted. His tone lacked any sense of apology. Surely you didn't bring us all here, simply to lie to us. The hall became dead silent. Mom looked over at me nervously. I gestured that it would be all right. Looks like things might get interesting before we leave, Regis thought, his eyes glittering in anticipation. This is not the kind of interesting we need right now, Sylvie reminded him. The same agitation that roiled just beneath the surface through our link was tangible in the hall, shown clearly in the body language of the 100 or more in attendance. What is Thyestes thinking? This question sparked a realization. My eyes narrowed as I focused on Cassius, who, after squeezing her hand gently, stepped away from Meyer. The light seemed to dim and focus further, so that only Cassius was fully lit. Even now, Ademir, you are resigned to this charade of fault-finding. Cassius's lips curled back from his teeth, baring them like an animal. This is no time for your instigation. You would divide our people in the exact moment that we. Fault-finding, Ademir scoffed. Instigation, if I am malcontent, my lord, it is with your failed leadership. For too long you've, pantheons, Cassius shouted, his voice transforming as it reverberated through the stones of the castle, the fully realized roar of a dragon. Your homes may soon spill through the wound to crash upon Decaden's shores. Currently the Lewin and Indrath clans are working to prevent such a fate, and yet your leadership seeks to use this moment to tear us down in elevation of himself. Ademir snarled. The bright purple eye on the right side of his head stared directly at me as he said, even during the end of our world as we know it, Cassius Indrath seeks to find the best footing, with his heel on our necks. Enough, Cassius answered, his voice again cool, almost emotionless. This is an emergency. We have no time for such quarrels. I call for the immediate removal of Clan Thyestes from their role as great clan of the Pantheons. The hall exploded with cries of dismay and furious shouts. This role will be refilled at such a time that Ephiodus is no longer in mortal peril. I pressed my eyes tightly shut. Ademir was right, of course. This was a calculated maneuver by Cassius. It was almost unbelievable that he'd be so petty, even in the middle of the collapse of his whole damned world. Almost. And yet, by removing Ademir, he solidifies the Asuran leadership and creates an environment where other Pantheon clans may work harder to curry his favor in the hope of rising to the rank of great clan. Ademir's hands flexed toward his weapon, and for a moment the entire room seemed to be balanced on a knife's edge, where the wrong word breathed in the wrong ear would be enough to pitch the balance toward violence. Grinding my teeth, I activated Godstep, and the etheric pathways carried me across the room in an instant. I appeared between Cassius and Ademir, wreathed in etheric lightning that rippled up my arms and down my legs. Realmheart lifted my hair up, and the crown of light, representing King's Gambit wrapped around it, floating over my head. Your home is dying. I gave a long, hard look at the Asuras gathered in the Great Hall. Lord Indrath wants you all to return to your homes. Keep your people calm. Prepare them for what's to come. Because your people are terrified, and when gods grow scared, bad, stupid, things start to happen. I met and held Ademir's four forward-facing eyes. All of you, your job is now to limit that stupidity while those who have a chance to fix this do so. Ademir's eyes burned into mine. I did not flinch away. All around, people were moving. The sylphs, led by Lady Erend, were already flying from the room. The Hamadryads were retreating from the castle as well, although Morwena stayed. Novus was still speaking to his people, but they appeared ready to depart. Chul had left the Phoenixes and was waiting with the rest of the clan. Finally, Ademir broke our eye contact. He half turned away, then paused, regarding me with one bright purple eye for just an instant before completing his turn. As he marched swiftly across the hall, his people fell behind him. Many shot rage-filled looks back. After a few seconds, Cordry broke away and followed the other Thyestes. Cassius's storm-purple eyes flicked to Cordry for a fraction of a second, the look too quick to be noticed if not for King's Gambit. I spun on Cassius. That was petty, I said in a whisper, so only he and Meyer could hear. Louder, I added, I'm going immediately. I leave my mother and sister in your care. My brows rose a fraction of an inch. I trust they'll be kept safe, and in very good hands. Mentally, I sent a message to Sylvie, who repeated my words, if more politely, to Varun and Zelena. That was well spoken, Lord Arthur, Cassius said. Good luck. And that, it appeared, was all he had to say, as the Lord of Dragons turned and marched swiftly away, convening with a nearby group of dragons led by Preya Inthara. Meyer gave me a wide smile. I'll see you on your way, she said, holding out an arm. I let her take mine, and we headed toward the exit. Sylvie, Regis, and Chul fell into step with us. Regis became incorporeal and drifted into my body. Ellie and Mom stood back, my mother clinging to my sister's arm. I held Ellie's focus, and my eyes widened ever so slightly, as if I could communicate everything that needed to be said with a look alone. I didn't need to worry them further. Then we were out of the grand hall and marching down a busy corridor lined with tapestries, paintings, and statues. I paid them no mind, having seen most before, and caring even less in that moment. Arthur, please no, you aren't being sent alone, Meyer said, her tone rich but her words very soft. No one, and I really do mean no one, understands the threat Agrona poses better than Cassius. He does not intend that you do this without aid. She said no more until we reached the massive front doors that opened out to the crystal bridge. I have something for you. She reached a hand toward me, and I must have tensed, because she held back. If you'll allow it. The corner of her mouth twisted wryly. After all, you can always break it yourself if you wish not to utilize it. Thinking I understood, I let her press a hand to my chest. Ether flowed and danced between us, wrapping through me and fastening itself to my core, my channels, my ether itself, nodding and re-nodding until it seemed intrinsically linked within me. The other end will connect with Kejis, she said simply, taking a step back. Can we trust this gift? Chul asked. He was standing with his legs wide and arms crossed, scowling at Meyer. Meyer cocked her head a few degrees to the side and regarded him sadly. Oh, child of the Jinn and the Asclepius. So badly, have we wronged you? Her voice caught, and she had to pause and swallow down the emotion. I would question, rather, if you didn't distrust us. Her hand reached out, and she took my chin. The hand, I realized, was wrinkled with age. You can trust me, Arthur. Please. Her words reached inside me, gripped something cold and withheld, and cracked it, the barrier of distrust that I had built up since discovering the truth behind the genocide of the Jinn. King's Gambit was still active. I had already absorbed the details of the moment, cataloging every aspect of her physicality, her tone, every indicator of honesty or deception that I had learned in either life. I took her wrist in my hand and gently lowered her arm away from my face. We'll see, won't we? But I let myself give her a small smile. For Sylvia, I couldn't feel Sylvie's mind, it was retracted away from King's Gambit, but heard her subtle intake of breath. Meyer's lips paled as they pressed together. From the way her eyes darted back and forth between my own, the straightening of her stance, and the shift of her brows, I knew I'd just struck a chord. She downplays the importance of her daughter's death, but Meyer felt that loss intensely. She still feels it. I rolled this thought around in my head, carried by multiple strands of my Godrun-enhanced consciousness. Meyer nodded and took a step back. For Sylvia, her fingers did a delicate dance in the air, and a portal opened in front of the bridge. The golden portal reflected the blood-red aurora. Its edges frayed and twisted, and a look of concentration came over Meyer's youthful face. Go, quickly, it's quite difficult to hold with the barrier between the worlds in its current state. She hesitated, then added, don't forget my binding, Arthur. I considered how to respond, realized there were no more words to be shared between us in that moment, and stepped through. A meat hook jerked within my ribs, and I grunted with pain as I stumbled into darkness. Regis leapt up from my flickering shadow, shaking himself and growling. I spun, looking back at the portal, which on this end bucked and wrenched wildly. When Sylvie stepped through, she gasped and her eyes rolled back in her head. I grabbed her, keeping her from falling. Easy, Sylv, you're okay, I said consolingly, pulling her to me. It was just the portal. Before she'd recovered, Chul tumbled out of the portal as well. He cursed and spit up a wad of blood, then turned and glared back at the rend in space. Bah, what in the black fire is this trickery? I'm okay, Sylvie said, disentangling herself from me. As she spoke, the portal ripped itself to tatters, and then faded entirely. Looks like it's going to be pretty hard to get back to Epheotis. Regis snorted. Get back, who needs to? It'll be here with us soon enough. Chul wiped blood from his lips. Let us hope not, my little lupine friend. Hey, who are you calling, little? Regis asked, although his heart wasn't in the banter. He was already turning to look around where we'd appeared. Oh, hey, look at that. We all looked in the direction his snout pointed. I realized we were in a wide open cavern. Despite being underground, the cave was brightly lit by dozens of floating lights. My feet sank into a heavy carpet of moss, and the walls were equally green with climbing moss and vines. My attention went not to the large tree that grew from the center of the cave, but rather to the copse of much smaller trees grown in a tidy row on the other end, making it look even more like the grove it was named for. Meyer had sent us straight to Vildoriel, and to Tess, Sylvie exclaimed as Tessia walked around the trunk of the tree, frowning in our direction. Tessia's hands were partially raised, and mana had been condensing around her. Her building spell was released in an instant, and a broad grin spread over her face. The expression cracked and broke almost as quickly as it had appeared. Grandpa, Arthur and Sylvie are here, she said, unable to disguise the strain in her voice. I hurried toward her, dropping Realmheart and King's Gambit. As I approached, she stopped. A faint tremble ran from her fingertips, up her arms, and then down her spine. I took her hands and gave them a firm squeeze. Oh, Arthur, she breathed, biting her lip. Everyone's been so afraid. Lady Saris said you'd likely be here soon, but... My brows rose in surprise. Saris is here. Tessia nodded, her fingers sliding between mine to lock our hands together. She held up her right hand and my left, and looked at them in deep consideration. Within an hour of that thing appearing in the sky, she says Agrona did something. Her face pinched together into the smallest of frowns. Can you? I shook my head. Sylvie and Chul had approached, and my bond moved in to give Tessia a firm side hug. Chul stood back a respectful distance, while Regis went loping around the tree. Tessia let her focus wander briefly, taking in the others. Then you're here for Agrona. Before I could answer, a pink fruit the size of a nectarine flew toward me. I had to pull Tessia aside, like I was leading her in a dance, in order to pluck the fruit out of the air. A second one sailed toward Regis, who snapped it up and swallowed it without chewing. 2 more flew toward Sylvie and Chul. Sylvie laughed as she smoothly caught hers, but Chul sidestepped his own, and it hit a rock with a wet splat and sprayed juice all over the ground. Virion took a bite of his own fruit and grinned darkly. The clouds gather and the storm crow wings in on bitter winds, I brat. Gramps, I said, feeling a rush of sentimentality. Virion approached and touched his forehead to mine, then kissed Tessia on the side of her head, his eyes lingering on our entwined fingers. Glad you're here, though I'll be damned if I know what you're going to do about that. He gestured up to the roof. I looked up at the obsidian dome, twinkly as it reflected the warmth of the floating lights. Somewhere beyond that, up through the sands of the Darvish Desert, the same wound visible in Epheotis would stretch across the sky here. If Lady Saris to be believed, it reaches all the way to Alakria, Virion said with a shake of his head. He suddenly smacked me hard on the biceps. Anyway, everyone's understandably losing their sense. It's good you got here before someone did something truly stupid. Amused, I considered the parallel between Virion's words and my own in speaking to the Asoras earlier. Do we have anyone in fighting shape? The Beast Corps, Adventurers Guild, he's going after Agrona, Tessia said, half exasperated, half proud. Of course he is, Virion said, staring into the middle distance thoughtfully. Better inform Saris and the Dwarven Lords immediately. I'll go, Sylvie said, already walking backwards toward the cave's single small entrance. I'll buy you 30 minutes. She gave me a knowing smile, then spun on her heel and marched away. Regis, you should head down to the Deep Labs and fetch Ren Kane and Gideon. He rolled his eyes and started trotting off after Sylvie. Fetch, what do I look like, a golden retriever? Virion stepped around us to look up at Chul. One of your clan is here. Soleil, the healer. She's been, Soleil, Chul interrupted, sharpening. He lost focus for a moment, likely searching for her mana signature, then snapped back and took a few steps before jerking to a halt. My brother Arthur, I would like your leave to go in search of my clan sister. I am eager to hear what brings one of the Asclepius out of the hearth, as well as to hear more about what Mordain is planning. I suppressed a smirk and instead gave him a grave bow. Of course, Chul, I'd like to know what Mordain can do to help as well. He returned my gesture with amusing seriousness and jogged away, his heavy footfalls audible until he began descending the winding stairs that led back down to Lodenhold, the Dwarven Palace. Still holding Tessia's hand, I meandered toward the row of trees. These have grown quite a bit since I was last here. Oh, don't bother, Virion said grumpily. We both know you're not here to talk with an old man about his arboriculture. He turned to walk away, heading back to the treehouse in the limbs of the large central tree. Over his shoulder, he said, once you're done snogging my granddaughter, though, I hope you can spare 10 minutes for your old mentor before you run off to save the world again. Grandpa, Tessia exclaimed, scandalized. I grinned despite myself, and for just a moment, the burden of everything still waiting for me out there was lessened. Don't reward him by being shocked. He'll only do it more. She shook out her gunmetal hair and released a put-upon sigh. That's true. He's been teasing me about you since I was only, 5 years old. She grew more somber. Gods, that feels like multiple lifetimes ago now. I stopped, tugging her hands as she spun around to face me. Taking both sides of her face in my hands, I drew her into a kiss. She tensed, but only for a heartbeat before leaning into it. We stayed like that, almost motionless, 2 statues locked in a tender expression of slowly conquered love, both still afraid to give in to the passion of it, but even more afraid to break away out of fear it could be the last time. But eventually the slow, frozen kiss did break. Tessia stepped into me and wrapped her arms around the small of my back, her head resting on my shoulder. A leaf tumbled from one of the sparse, 12-foot-tall trees we stood under, fluttered down, and caught in her hair. I stared at it, so like the pendant I'd given her the night we made our promise above the wall. "What happens next?" she asked, her arms tightening around me as if afraid her words might startle me away. There was something deeply intimate about feeling her hands resting against my spine, where the god runes rested dormant beneath my skin. I realized I still had a barrier up, a literal layer of hardened ether between us, armor that I never took off. With some effort, I did then, releasing the ether to be reabsorbed into my core. Tessia shifted as the barrier between us melted away, subconsciously detecting its removal even if she didn't know exactly what had just changed. I pressed my face into her gunmetal hair and kissed the top of her head. "I was thinking maybe we could rebuild my parents' old house in Ashbur," I said. My fingers traced the soft skin of her side, slightly exposed where her shirt had ridden up when she pressed against me. "Except bigger. With lots of guest rooms." Tessia giggled, nuzzling into me. "That sounds beautiful. I like the sound of lots of guests. But, you know that's not what I meant." "I know," I said into her hair. "But, let's talk about anything other than Agrona, Ephiodus, and the Asura right now." Playfully, I scooped her up, spun her, and then dropped us both onto a bed of thick moss. She squealed, swatted me playfully, then grabbed the back of my neck and pulled me into another kiss, her lips moving experimentally over my own. And there, for a while, we simply let ourselves exist in each other's embrace. I shut out thoughts of the wound in the sky, of the battle to come, of the impossible task of saving the Asuras and their home. Together, for a few short minutes, we simply were. 513. Arthur Lewin. Time slipped by like water running between my fingers. I was lying on my back in the moss, staring up at the thin canopy of Virian's small grove. Tessia lay in the crook of my arm, her head on my chest, her fingers tracing the line of my sternum, over my core. The sensation sent warm chills down my arms in a way I found pleasantly exhilarating. "I can feel your core," she said softly, her fingers pausing in their constant movement. "Its pressure is like a heavy blanket." I felt her smile against my chest. "It's pretty cozy, actually." I let out a surprised chuckle. "Then all of my work has been well worth it." She swatted me playfully. "I'm being serious." I pulled her closer, nuzzling my cheek into her hair. "So am I." We stayed like that for another minute or two before the silence and peace were broken by a voice in my mind. "I've convinced Saris and the Dwarven Lords to await your arrival in Lodenhold," Sylvie communicated, "but only just. I'd say you have about 10 minutes before they come barging up into the grove to find you." I must have tensed, because Tessia drew away, leaning up on an elbow to examine my face. Regis's voice followed. "Gideon and the rest of his cohort of kooky creatives are on the way as well. Ren Kane isn't here, apparently. He left the moment the big hole in the sky formed." "Time to get back to work?" Tessia asked with a small pout. I nodded, and she gracefully rose and brushed a few strands of moss from her clothing. Even in the plain garb of someone who has been working the soil for these last weeks, she was stunning. As she looked down at me, her brows rose and her lips twisted wryly. "Don't tell me you have to go and then look at me like that, Arthur Lewin." I felt myself blush, cleared my throat as I stood, and rubbed the back of my neck. Tessia took my hand, laughing. "All the power in the world, but you still blush like a schoolboy in his first term." With a tug, she led me back toward the central tree and the little house in its branches. We made it halfway before Virian appeared, descended the stairs, and began moving to meet us. "Byron just messaged that they're waiting for us," he grumbled, drying wet hands off on his dirt-stained trousers. "But I'm glad you two lovebirds had a minute or two alone. Now, Arthur, before we get down there, what in the abyss is happening in the sky?" As we left the Elshire Grove and began descending the long series of switchback stairs that would take us directly to Lodenhold Palace, I filled Virian and Tessia in on everything that had happened. "Damn," Virian muttered under his breath. "Frankly, I was hoping Saris was wrong. So all that, and Agrona is definitely still out there, and with some kind of weapon we can't even fathom." Although he didn't say it, I felt Virian's thoughts turn to Elenoir and the Asuran technique that had destroyed it. I wonder why he waited so long to use it. "I get the impression that this wasn't exactly his plan," I answered, having given it a fair bit of thought myself. "This seems desperate. A last stand." We continued to discuss the details until we reached Lodenhold. Byron and Veray were waiting for us. Byron gave me a serious nod. "Arthur, everyone is understandably anxious to hear what you have to say." "I hope they're not expecting good news," I said matter-of-factly. Veray responded with the ghost of a smile, the equivalent of a huge grin on her normally inexpressive face. They're expecting Lance Godspell, Regent of Decathan, to wave his hands and fix the world, naturally. I raised one brow and gestured for the two lances to lead the way. How are you adjusting to integration? Veray flexed the conjured hand of ice that acted as a prosthetic in place of the arm she'd lost fighting Tachi. I could feel the mana flowing through her, infusing her entire body, her channels and veins constantly circulating it even without a core. I am uncertain whether or not to consider myself lucky that I didn't go through this process in the middle of the war, she said wryly. I do not think I have ever been so weak as I was in the weeks afterwards, and yet. I nodded in understanding. Here you are with all this new power and control, and the war is over. Is it though? Virian asked from just behind us. There may yet be cause for you to use this strength in service of Decathan, Lance Veray. We reached the doorway that opened into the Hall of Lords, guarded by several armored dwarven mages. Micah was standing with her cousins, Hornfuls and Skarn. At the sound of our approach, she floated up off the ground so she could look me in the eyes. She made a show of looking me over, then said, "And here I expected you'd have purple skin or horns or wings or something by now, Lord Arthur." Although her tone was cool and distant, her initial scowl settled into a passive expression after a few seconds, and she turned and flew into the chamber ahead of us. I followed behind but missed a step as I rounded the corner into the hall, surprised to find it entirely full. As always, the meeting place itself was set atop the floating slate of crystal, which was reached by walking over a series of smaller floating slates, like stones across a calm river. The table at which the dwarven lords normally met had been shrunk down, allowing more room around it for a second row of chairs. Perhaps it was the tension, or only my own mood, but the colorful crystal of the giant geode's interior didn't seem to flash with the same brightness they usually held. Saris was already moving toward me, marching over the floating path with no concern for the height, even as the slates shifted slightly beneath her feet. "Arthur, I'm glad we were finally able to get your attention." "Saris, how bad is it?" "Less than ideal," she answered with a small shake of her head. In the unearthly light of the geode, her hair shone with the same amethyst quality, and her alabaster skin reflected the colors of the surrounding crystal formations. She was adorned in a black battle dress that covered her from the neck down. Her horns gleamed. "The people are suffering, leaderless." Agrona sent a message, just before attacking the rift. "Even if they fear what he's done, the show of strength has drawn many back to his cause." Behind her in the packed chamber, Silrit and Sylvie floated in the open air off to the side of the central table and platform. Micah, Byron, and Veray moved to the other side of the chamber, while Chull and a phoenix woman, Soleil, one of the healers who had helped after Chull's near death, hovered at the far end of the platform behind a seated Carnelian Earthborn. Micah's father sat at the head of the table, while the Silvershales, Daglan, Durgar, and Daymore, sat to his right. A few other representatives of powerful dwarven clans were there, as well as Gideon, Emily, and Claire Bladeheart, who wasn't currently inside her exoform. Lyra Dryde occupied a seat next to the one vacated by Saris. Across from her, Saria Triscan, an elven woman of middle age, had kept a couple of seats open, probably for Tessia and Virian. "I can only assume that you've returned because you intend to go after him," Saris continued. "It seems as if his greater goal requires neither Ephiotis nor this world to remain intact. He is burning his own people like fuel." She took a deep breath, her focus turning inward momentarily. When her gaze returned to me, she gave me a look I couldn't recall seeing from her before, not even when she'd nearly killed herself barring Agrona's forces from the relictums. I felt a distinct sense of reversal from our very first meeting, so long ago, when she saved my life from Yuto. "He isn't insane, Arthur. He would only do this," she gestured vaguely upward, "if he knew he could not only survive it, but that it would advance his goals." Saris returned to her seat, and I allowed Virian and Tessia to move past me and take their own. Before I could speak, the sound of quickly approaching footsteps came from the open doors behind me. I turned to see Curtis and Kathy L.N. Glader being led by Hornfuls. Kathy L.N. gave him a perfunctory thanks, then swept into the chamber. I floated off the crystals and made way for them. "Well, the gang really is all here," I said warmly. Despite the tension that had grown between the Gladers and myself after the war, I was nonetheless glad to see them. "Please, take a seat. We were just about to get started." "Arthur," Kathy L.N. said. She maintained her usual hard-held passivity, but there was a glimmer in her eyes and a tremor in her mana signature that said more than her words ever would. Curtis frowned and gave me a shallow bow. "Arthur, been a while, old friend." There was no time for niceties, however, and so the leaders of Sapin took their seats. I wasted no more time. The barrier that separates Epheotis from our world is broken. The pocket of molded space containing their world is collapsing. That is what you see in the sky. There was a roar of panicked voices, but I snapped for them to be silent, and they collectively complied. I cast a long, hard look around at Decaden's leaders. Lances and lords, princes and princesses. Let me make something clear. There is no time for panic. Your instincts might, even now, be demanding you eke out the best you can for yourselves, your people, but any individual goals you have now are nothing. Until this is resolved, we will work together, doing everything we can to ensure the survival of not only this world but of Epheotis as well. The Hall of Lords was entirely silent. Saria Triskan's jaw worked silently, and Micah's brow raised slightly, but the rest only watched me intently. Saris, what can you tell us about how this was done? All eyes turned to her. Her own hard gaze lingered in the far distance, up through the crystalline interior shell of the giant geode. Tegrin Kylum has been inaccessible since Agrona's false body was struck down here in Decaden. There has been no way to verify anything for certain, but I have developed a likely working theory. She paused, waiting to see if anyone interrupted her. They didn't, so she continued. Tegrin Kylum is enormous, and full of places no one except Agrona can reach. In my probing over the years, I have discovered pockets of machinery running through the core that I believe extend far down into the roots of the mountain. It is clear now that these artifacts and devices are part of the mechanism that he utilized to draw power from all the mages of Alakria. I won't pretend to understand exactly how he has achieved this seemingly impossible act of magic, except to say that he has had more than enough time to dissect and recreate all manner of ancient Jinn technologies. I suspect this technology and magic was used to power a weapon and strike the rift, which he previously failed to take control of. He has a sort of Jinn remnant or personality housed within his reliquary, Tessia chimed in, looking from Saris to me. She controls all sorts of things, as far as I can understand it, from Cecilia, from her memories. Soleil spoke up from where she hovered near the geode wall. I felt the strike, the magic and energy utilized. It carried the same ferocity and disturbance of mana that the Pantheon's World Eater technique utilized when it struck Elenwar. I saw Virion, Tessia, and Saria all tense at the mention of the Asuran technique that destroyed Elenwar. It seems likely he based this weapon on a similar principle to the Pantheon's secret technique, Soleil finished nervously. Which means if he turns it on any of our cities, that could be the end of Sapin or Darv in a blink. The younger Silvershale son said. His face was red, but his eyes were wide and terrified. We should have marched on Alakria weeks ago, we told you. We warned you that. It is time to mobilize, I said over the young lord. Only those Alacrians who actively choose to stand with Agrona are our enemies, but I do not expect to find many of them. I'm going to attack Tegrin Kylum directly, and as soon as possible. I'd like whatever forces Decaden or Alakria can muster. You have the beast core, obviously, Gideon said immediately, slapping his hand on the table. We've managed to bring a couple dozen more units online, and their pilots are trained up enough not to kill themselves in the operation of the exoforms. How inspiring of confidence, Curtis Glader muttered. Saris spoke next. Cara de Juarez, at this moment, organizing what forces we have. Due to the repeated siphoning of the Alacrian people's mana, our fighting force will be limited. Also, we've been made aware of sycophantic refugees attempting to brave the Basilisk Fang Mountains on foot to reach Tegrin Kylum, but I can't say for sure what we'll find when we get there. At the very least, they will be equally weakened by the pulses. Soleil cleared her throat. My Lord Arthur, forgive me for not saying so immediately, but Mordain has decided that it is time for the Asclepius to lend their aid as well. As of an hour ago, he was gathering anyone willing to fight and preparing to leave the hearth. You will have phoenixes in support of this mission, even if Epheotis itself does not send aid. I blinked, surprised. That's excellent news, Soleil. Thank you. It was a risk for Mordain to leave the hearth and come out into the open, but I was glad to have his assistance. I focused on Kathy LN, who I hoped would speak up. Although the last few years had seen us grow further apart, she once had been a close and trusted friend. Even her symbolic support would mark a de-escalation in that building tension. But before she answered, a horrible tremor shook the very mana that suffused the air and ground around us. The Hall of Lords became a chorus of moans, dismayed shouts, and pained screams. Hands pressed against heads and chests and the tremor scratched like nails on a chalkboard through everyone's core. The floating platform suddenly listed to the right, and chairs began to slide over its surface. The table lurched, smashing into Gideon's side of the platform and threatening to take a dozen people over the edge. With a flash of etheric lightning, I God-stepped below the platform and caught it from below, keeping it from tilting further. Saria Triskin plummeted over the edge in front of me, and I plucked her out of the air. At the same time, I felt the gravity of the room wobble as Micah attempted to counter the shifting waves of magical disturbance. "Out! Everybody out!" Carnelian was shouting. I felt the shifting weight and hammering of rushed steps above me and heard the crashing of the smaller gem-like slates falling to the ground and shattering among the sharp crystalline protrusions below. Mana condensed, and vines burst out of the walls, cracking the geode as they wove together to form a bridge. "Go!" Virion shouted. Saria clung to me fearfully. The expression made her look younger than she was, and I suddenly saw the resemblance to Aaliyah, the young lance I had found dead so long ago, before we even knew Alakria existed. The collective mana signatures of those in attendance escaped the room just as something above sundered. I felt the air move as the geode's roof came crashing down. Ether wrapped around me, and I pulled Saria into the etheric pathways to appear in the corridor outside, a few feet beyond the crowd. Tour. Sylvie turned her head as she felt me move, looking relieved, even as dust billowed out into the hallway from the ruined Hall of Lords. Instead of looking back, her gaze turned upwards. "What was that?" Lord Silvershale demanded, looking around as if anyone there might have answers. I didn't bother with them, but eased Saria down and instead pulled Sylvie, Chul, Tessia, and Saris to me. Saris, in particular, looked at me with some confusion, but then God's step was activating again, and all 5 of us were pulled through the pathways. Normally, I had to see where I was going, but with my new Godrune active as well, I found that my sense of the space around me was drastically enhanced. In an instant, we were standing atop the sun-baked dunes. "Vritra's horns," Saris muttered, her hand going to her mouth. "I do not like the look of that," Chul said simply. I stared into the sky, mouth open, mind momentarily blank. The wound was ripping at the edges, space coming apart like flesh under too much force. The bloody red aurora oozed grotesquely around it as the edges widened. Belatedly, I reached for my sense of the folded space keeping it in check, but the bindings were gone. They'd collapsed as the wound widened. "Damn it," I muttered. Then, as the words were still leaving my tongue, the bottom dropped out of my stomach. A piece of land, a dense forest full of willow-like trees covered in pink-dappled leaves, jutted out through the wound like a shard of broken bone sticking up from torn skin. "No," Sylvie breathed, her pulse leaping. The Ephiodan land began to break apart and, like a meteor shower entering the atmosphere, fell glowing toward Decathan. It was difficult to get a sense of the scale. The wound now dominated almost the entire sky, stretching from horizon to horizon. As the giant chunks of rock, earth, and forest split apart, some seemed to fall as nothing but specks in the distance, far beyond the grand mountains, while others grew larger and larger. "Look," Tessia pointed, grabbing my hand and squeezing fiercely. Her extended finger indicated a series of 7 or 8 broken pieces of land that were clearly going to fall in the desert around us. The ground shook as, beside me, Chul launched into the air. His form glowed fire orange as he streaked toward the largest of the broken pieces of land. Saris began conjuring a cutting wind of void magic, rapidly swirling into a towering tornado. Tessia cast a spell, and the plants of another shattered chunk of Ephiodan soil exploded outward, trailing through the air and slowing the meteor's ascent. Regis leapt from me, his body pulsating as it expanded, wings spreading out from his back, and then his hulking, jagged destruction form shot into the air, amethyst flames building in his chest as he prepared to obliterate another of the tumbling pieces of ground. A ripple went out through the ether, and time slowed to a crawl. I glanced at Sylvie, only the 2 of us and Regis were unaffected, and sent a quick thought. Then with God's step and King's gambit both empowered, I formed my ether into a blade, lined up my strike, and swept the weapon in a wide arc. There were flashes of violet light from the closest bits of falling landmass not already being targeted by my companions. For a breath, nothing happened, then time jerked back into full speed, and half a dozen small, tree-studded islands exploded. In the air, raining down rubble instead of colliding with the desert with the force of their full mass. Saris's wind caught, slowed, and chewed apart a large mass. Chul's hammer, blazing with orange fire, rammed into the bottom of a spiraling hunk of stone, soil, and tree roots, shattering it. Regis burned another away to nothing with a gout of destruction-infused breath. 300 feet away, another mass of forestland collided with the desert sands, sending up a towering plume of golden silt. Farther, Many miles in the distance, we saw other collisions. Clouds of dust and debris rose into the air in a dozen places, suddenly and viscerally reminding me of bombs being dropped from planes back on Earth, during the long war one oversaw. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Sarah's frown and reach into a hidden pocket within her dress. She unrolled a small scroll, on which burning letters were currently being written. "What is it?" I asked, although I already suspected the truth from the few words I could make out. "Another pulse from Tigran Kylum." She looked up at the wound in the sky, the red reflecting in her eyes. "Kara is reporting mass casualties this time." I winced. "And your fighting forces?" She sighed, a flicker of guilt crossing her porcelain features. "Most are shielded in the Relictum's first level, awaiting orders. They will be ready to fight." "Arthur." I looked up to find Tessia focused on the landmass her parachute of plant life had brought slowly to the ground. For a moment, I thought her conjured vines and broad leaves were moving, but only for a moment. I God-stepped, appearing 10 feet from the crumbling mound just as a mana beast like a legged, three-headed snake leapt out of the undergrowth. I had a blade in my hand and was swinging before the creature's paws had even touched the sand, and yet it still managed to twist away from my attack, two heads darting left to add momentum to its body while one dipped low and struck toward me. I brought my knee up to catch it under the chin as I turned, and the serpent-like head and long neck rocked. The ether blade came down across the neck, severing the head, which tumbled through the air. A spray of venomously green liquid arced from its fangs, splashing me across the neck. I hissed at the pain, flinching back, and missed the second head as it snapped forward, sinking into my calf. From the corner of my eyes, I saw a second of the beast's lunge, but the thick vines lashed out and wrapped around it, dragging it back toward the patch of forest. A flick of my blade severed the second neck of the beast I was fighting. I spun past a strike from the third, and hacked it from the beast's body as well. The body itself, like that of a bloated snake that had eaten a wild cat, the legs of which then burst from its belly, stumbled back and forth for a moment before slumping to the ground. Chul crashed down from above, leading with his weapon. The round head blazed with phoenix fire as it smashed through the second Ephiodon beast's spine, killing it instantly. I raised a hand to my neck, where the skin had melted from the acidic spit. When I took a step, I hitched, feeling the burning venom attempting to dissolve my leg from within. The others finally caught up with me. Tessia was staring at my wounds in horror, but the rest had seen me in much worse condition. Ether was already rushing to the wounds, fighting out the venom and healing the damaged tissue. But if it had been anyone else? I scanned the horizon and found movement. A quarter mile away, a similar snake-like mana beast was dragging itself from another impact site. "Shit," I muttered. Options began to spread out before King's Gambit-like scrolls and parchment at a war council. If the wound stretched all the way to Alakria, this newest pulse from Agrona's machinery could have unsettled it, ripping it free of the folded space and allowing it to expand again. Even with Kejus's people working to hold it in place on the other side, Ephiodus was already beginning to come through. The falling debris itself was a danger. A large enough mass striking a populated area would level an entire city. If someplace like Xyrus were struck, the entire population could be wiped out in a moment. We'd just proven that it was possible to prevent some collisions, but how many mages in Decaden were capable of knocking these masses out of the sky before they did damage? But the physical impacts were only half the problem. These Ephiodon mana beasts were almost ubiquitously S-class or stronger, by Decaden's standard of measuring strength. Just a few could prove a catastrophe if unleashed near populated areas. The wounds I was already healed of would have put any but the very strongest mages out of commission, if not killed them outright. Even an army of dwarves and humans would struggle to put down a wave of such creatures. Decaden would need immediate and sure-footed leadership, and warriors capable of holding their own against Ephiodon beasts. At the same time, news of a third pulse from Agrona's machines meant he had likely regained whatever power had been spent in his strike against the rift. If that was true, then it was even possible he might use the weapon again. If he struck the rift a second time, what kind of escalation might happen? As yet more collapsing chunks of Ephiodus rained down in the distance, I tried to imagine all of Ephiodus's magically expanded continent suddenly slamming into the Grand Mountains, but I couldn't fully comprehend the cataclysmic proportions of such an act of destruction. I couldn't stay and defend Decaden, because I needed to face Agrona directly. He had to be prevented from absorbing more power or utilizing his weapon again, perhaps targeting it at Xyrus this time, or Darv, or Ediston. Regardless of how he used it, I knew that if he was allowed to use it again, the resulting destruction would almost certainly make it impossible to achieve the vision of the future I'd shown to fate. My mind sorted through all these thoughts and more in the space between one breath and the next. I scanned the faces of those present, considering how best to use each of the soldiers at my command. Sylvie and Regis were a part of me, and their natural insight into Avum and Vivum may prove necessary in the conflict to come. Chul was a warrior of unmatched caliber in either Decathan or Alakria, and although his defense of the people against the crumbling Ephiodus would certainly be impactful, I knew he would accept nothing other than fighting Agrona at my side. I needed Saris in Alakria, of course, even more so now. Finally, my gaze settled on Tessia. If it weren't for the cool rationality of King's Gambit, I would have tasted bile in the back of my throat. Like Ellie and Mom, I couldn't afford to tuck her in a safe place. If this were a sovereign's quarrel board, I needed to utilize all my pieces to the best of both my and their abilities. Tessia had remained aware through most of her ordeal in Alakria. She had spent more time with Agrona than even Saris, and seen much of Tagrin Kylem's inner workings. No part of me wanted to bring her into that place, but I knew our chances of success were better with her than without. It was then that the others finally reached the surface. Silrit flew out of a distant opening hidden within a ravine, followed rapidly by the lances and then Soleil. Micah and Veray carried most of the council on sheets of stone and ice. They didn't come to us, but stopped just outside the ravine, collectively staring around at the burning detritus falling from the wound, and the raw, raging wound itself. At the same time, I sensed the powerful mana signatures coming from the east. Rays of blinding orange phoenix fire destroyed several dozen falling masses between Darv and the Grand Mountains, and a couple dozen specks appeared in the distance, rapidly growing larger. A plan coalesced. I flew toward Gideon, ignoring panicked questions shouted by the other leaders. Send out the Beast Corps. Map strike points and focus on defending populated areas. If we have exoforms capable of destroying the land masses before impact, make sure they're located in cities. I want 10, Claire Bladeheart and her best soldiers, ready to depart to Alakria immediately. I trust you can get one of the new long-range portals activated. My attention shifted to the leaders. Get your forces together. We need messengers to the Alakria settlements. They should fall back behind the wall. Send the Adventurers Guild to more remote settlements. A lot depends on exactly where the rubble is falling. If necessary, evacuate civilians into the deeper tunnels throughout Darv, where they'll be sheltered from the worst of the impacts. I turned away, once again ignoring pleas and follow-up questions from the huddled dwarves and elves. Feeling within me, I took hold of the etheric tether Meyer had conjured and pushed out through it. Kejis, if you can hear me, we need more help. Ephiodus is coming through, raining down on Decathan and likely Alakria. Beasts, too. The entire continent is going to be obliterated by a meteor shower if we don't do something. There was a moment where nothing happened. I watched as the distant specks marking Mordain and his phoenixes raced toward us at incredible speed. Arthur, we are doing everything we can. I cannot risk leaving the wound, nor will I send anyone through until we have it stabilized again. This is Agrona's doing, find him and kill him. Now, my jaw clenched, and my fists tightened until they ached. It wasn't good enough, but I knew it would be a waste of my mental energy to argue with him. Instead, I rose into the air and flew to meet Mordain. The ancient phoenix, flanked by almost 30 of his kin, arrived only moments later. Most of the phoenixes did not stop, but fanned out, continuing to destroy falling debris and hunting mana beasts across the desert floor. Arthur, he began, his normally passive, kindly face now twisted with anxiety and indecision. The Asclepius have come to help however we can. Ren Kane and the rest have already spread out, heading to the far corners of this continent. A few remain in the beast glades to help stabilize the rift from this side. I held out my hand and took his gladly. Your timing couldn't be better. I know what a risk it is for you, and I thank you for it. The people of this continent need aid. We need to stop as much of this debris as possible. Mordain gave me a weak smile, but the strength that emanated from him was anything but. Of course, we will do whatever we can. His eyes slipped off me, up to the sky. There is no undoing this, Arthur. I rested a hand on his shoulder, following his gaze. No, maybe not, but whatever happens to Ephiodus, I have another problem to take care of first. Mordain was silent as I turned back to my companions, the pieces of my plan still rapidly sliding into place. Get ready, I said simply. One way or another, this is the beginning of the end. 514. Arthur Leywin. What followed was a mad rush of preparation. I bid the Gladers farewell before they quickly returned to Ediston to organize and prepare their own troops. Emily Watskin rushed off in order to oversee the setup and activation of all newly designed long-range teleportation units, the ones modeled after Nico's design, in order to allow a rapid dissemination of Beast Corps pilots across the continent. Lyra Dryde and Saria Triskin offered to be our messengers to Blackbend, where Helen Shard oversaw the efforts of the Adventurers Guild. From there, the pair would head on to the Wall, and then to the Alacrian refugee villages and elven encampments beyond. Carnelian Earthborn and Daglan Silvershale were quick to agree that they would send dwarven mages all throughout Sapin, and the rest of the dwarven lords immediately fell in behind them. Although I was surprised by this sudden sense of camaraderie with the wider world, I was glad to see that even the stubborn dwarven lords saw reason in the face of catastrophe. 2 hours after the first pieces of Epheotis fell, I found myself standing far underground within an observation deck, looking out at the vast laboratory Ren Kane had carved out for the development and testing of the exoforms and their fire salt-imbued weapons. Although I chafed at so many delays, I couldn't leave until I knew Decaden was prepared, or as prepared as it could be, to hold off the continuing bombardment of its surface by Epheotis. Rows upon rows of exoforms, each one unique based on the specific combination of beast components utilized, stood open before me as freshly trained pilots streamed in from Vildoriel and beyond. All over the laboratory, cores were spinning up, sending light and mana spilling through exoforms that then shifted, adjusting stances and rolling arm and neck joints in imitation of their pilots as the connection was formed. Claire Bladeheart and a handful of other ranking pilots were directing the soldiers, who maneuvered their machines into formation as each one finished its initialization. They may not be as powerful or versatile as the strongest mages out there, Gideon said, but absent official channels of leadership, I can maneuver them around where they need to be more quickly than begging soldiers from Darv or Sapin. Good that you're taking a few with you, though. You'll finally get to see them in action. He looked me over seriously, and his surprisingly intact brows rose. You know, Arthur, I've been rethinking the designs on some of those ranged weapons. Tell him, Gid, I still think it's a gross failure of Arthur's creativity that I wasn't given a couple of bazookas attached to my sides, Regis cut in. Bah, bazookas? Gideon asked, frowning curiously. A strong name for a projectile-based system, perhaps one that. I waved a hand as if brushing their words out of the air. We've been over this. It's not a road you want to go down. A few minutes later, Claire and the other 9 exoform pilots who would be accompanying me, 10 of the best Gideon had, were ready to go. It was a long walk through the tunnels back up into Vildoriel. I'll admit, Arthur, I'm still a little fuzzy on what we're doing here, Claire said, falling in beside me as I hurried along. Her exoform towered over me, and its clawed feet left bright scratches in the stone floor with each step. With 3 lances, a scythe, a couple of white core-level mages, you have 2 Asura going with you. What do you think 10 non-mages? She winced and quickly adjusted her wording, 10 exoforms are going to add. Didn't Gideon cover this with you? I asked, surprised. She gave an uncertain shrug and the exoform copied her, a movement that almost would have been amusing if the machine itself wasn't so strange to look at. Master Bastius is, not always exactly clear in his communication. I chuckled. Fair enough. Before I answered her question, however, I paused to choose my words carefully. I don't expect you to fight Wraiths of Ritra. Your weapons are highly proficient at bypassing shields, which the Alacrian mages rely on entirely for their defense. If there is a battle, you represent an unknown for the Alacrians. Except for maybe anyone who was also at the last battle of Vildoriel, no one there will know what you are or how best to counter you. But also, Claire, you, the Beast Corps, these exoforms, represent an important path to empowerment for all those without mana in both Decaden and Alacria. I'm not doing you or these others a favor, I'm putting you into danger, and I want you to keep that in mind, but, I wanted the Beast Corps to have a place here. Claire was silent for some time as we strode on, the line moving at a quick pace. Just as I thought our conversation was over, she spoke again. Thank you, Arthur, for this. Within the exoform, she gestured down to its mesh of beast parts, mechanics, and magic. Don't mistake my question, I'm glad to be going to Tegrin Kylum, for the chance to fight back against those who attacked us in Xyrus all those years ago. I couldn't bring myself to smile, but I did incline my head slightly in acknowledgement. Your squad will be the vanguard if we face opposition outside of the fortress, under the command of Ceres. I will attempt to breach whatever barriers have been put in place, and then the lances, my companions, and I will take the fight directly to Agrona inside Tegrin Kylum. When we reached Vildoriel, we found our path forward blocked by a dense crowd. In the distance, rows upon rows of dwarven soldiers passed through a portal, and the entire population of the city had come out to watch them. It was a somber affair, with little or no ovation for these soldiers. I considered searching for another path forward, but Claire stepped forward. The crowd separated by necessity, pressing back into one another until there was room for the hulking machine to pass through. Once at the front, she began to clap, her metallic hands crashing together like a hammer against an anvil. For a moment, those around her were startled. Then, though, the air began to change. Smiles appeared on dour faces, slow but inexorable. A scattering of applause joined her, and then the audience erupted into a full-blown roaring cheer. The rest of the exoform pilots joined in, but their applause could not ring louder than the cacophonous roar of the crowd. Pulling up my hood to hide my features, I wove through the crowd to Claire's side, clapping for the dwarves alongside everyone else. "Well done," I said. "They're soldiers, and they're going into incredible danger to people who've offered them little respect, who not so long ago, they considered enemies." Through the transparent mana shielding, I could just see the woman within, her gaze forward, fiercely on the dwarves as she spoke. For some, this will be the last time they see their home. They shouldn't leave it in sullen silence. We stayed for a few more minutes, watching the dwarves march through the portal in twos and threes. When I could stand idle no longer, I knocked on the exoform's hip to get Claire's attention, then began up the crowded, curving highway, the line of exoforms following me. I could already feel the mana signatures of my companions in the distance, near the top of the cavern at Lodenhold. The highway in front of the palace had been cleared, and only a handful of guards remained. Many of the dwarven lords, who were almost all mages, were accompanying their soldiers to Sapin. This had been Damor Silvershale's idea. The young dwarf had argued that he hadn't received a spellform just to hide within the ground while death rained down on the surface, and had then been one of the first through the portal. "Is everything ready?" I asked as I reached the others, looking around at the group who would be accompanying me to Alakria: Viray, Byron, Micah, Tessia, Chull, and Sylvie. Saris and Silrit were missing, likely still dealing with the portal. "We were just waiting for you and your exoforms," Viray answered. Virion, who stood with Tessia, grunted. "We're already starting to get messages back, and the first few dozen refugees have arrived." He looked over the edge of the highway down to where a cluster of frightened-looking humans were being led from the tunnel connecting to the replaced teleportation gate. "Our efforts are proving effective. He hesitated, his gruff voice suddenly harsh with emotion. He cleared his throat. "I'll be heading to Elenoir immediately. The few groves that have already started to take root there, we don't want to lose them." I gave him an understanding half-smile. "Protect your home, your people. Don't give an inch." He coughed and wiped a hint of moisture from his eyes, then pulled me into a hug, smacking my back forcefully. "You take care of my granddaughter, Brat." "Of course, Gramps." I returned the gesture more tenderly. "Grandpa, I'm right here," Tessia said teasingly. Faster than expected, his hand snapped out, grabbed her by the wrist, and pulled her into a group hug with us, laughing. Soon Tessia and I were laughing along with him. "Adorable," Micah said nearby, rolling her eyes but unable to suppress a smirk. Sharp steps drew my attention to Lodenhold's main entrance, which loomed above us. Saris was striding in our direction, Silrit at her side and Emily hurrying behind them. Virion cleared his throat and pushed his way free of the hug he'd initiated. "Well, the sky is falling, Brat. This is no time to just stand around. The portal is calibrated," Saris said without preamble. "I'm aware of a receiving platform north of Kargiden, inside the Basilisk Fang Mountains. It's occasionally used to move larger numbers of soldiers to and from Tegrin Kylum for training operations. We won't be able to teleport directly to the fortress, but this will get us as close as possible. I've already sent a message to Kara for our soldiers to begin tempest warping there to meet us." Emily fiddled with her glasses as she regarded us nervously. "Not to rush you, Regent, but Gideon would like this portal for transportation of the other exoforms once you've left." "We should go immediately," Silrit added. "We've already lost precious hours." Viray gave me a fierce look, nodded, and led the way, followed by Micah, Silrit, and Saris. Sylvie squeezed Virion's hand, gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, then motioned for Chull, and the pair of them trailed after the others. Byron stood tall but stiff in front of Virion. "Sir, it has been an honor. Thank you for the opportunity to support you as your lance." Virion, already red-eyed, scratched at his stubble and glanced away, but only for a second. When he looked back, his gaze glinted with the steel of a man who had been king, who had led the entire continent in a war at unwinnable odds. And thank you for your support, Byron Wykes, Lance of Decaden. He strongly emphasized the last word. Byron saluted his commander, spun on his heels, then marched toward Lodenhold. I gestured to Claire, and she led the exoform pilots after Byron. Tessia started to walk away, stopped, and ran to Virion, kissing him on the other cheek from Sylvie. You be safe, okay. I tapped 2 fingers to my temple in a sort of casual salute, then Tessia and I followed the others. Art, before we go, Tessia began haltingly. She produced something from her pocket and held it out. The dark, multifaceted stone I had used to see my mother and sister from afar. Oh, hey, the Creeper's stone, Regis said. Looks broken again, he added, drawing my attention to cracks running through it. I took it and turned it over in my hand, inspecting the fractures. I found it at your mom's place, she said. Ellie told me it had been broken. To save it from Winsome, I confirmed, recalling Ellie mentioning it in the weeks we stayed in Epheotis after Agrona's defeat. Ether bloomed from me, spilling down my arms in individual, bright motes as Aroa's Requiem activated. The motes danced across the relic's surface, fusing the cracks. I resisted the urge to check on Ellie and Mom, instead storing the relic in my dimension rune. Thanks, I said, brushing her fingers with mine. I figured you'd be worried about them, she said with a shrug as we stepped into Lodenhold's outer hall. The exoform pilots were already striding through, and Saris and Silrit were gone. The others looked at me, and I nodded. They began to step through one by one. Soon, it was just Emily and me standing in front of the arcane frame emitting the bright, opaque portal. My thoughts wandered to those first days at Xyrus Academy when I'd met her in Gideon's class, back when he'd been a professor. She chuckled and adjusted her glasses. Who'd have guessed this is where we'd end up? She asked as if reading my thoughts. Her smile slipped, and her gaze fell to the ground, then snapped back to me. She stepped closer and took my hand in both of her own. Oh, cripes, but I wish I had something smarter to say than just, well, be careful, Arthur. Come back to us. She shook her head, and thick hair fell over her face. This world is going to need you just as much when Agrona is gone. She laughed again, almost a sob. There's still the world of the gods crashing into us to deal with. As her face fell, her glasses slipped down her nose. I pushed them back into place with a chuckle. With minds like yours in it, Miss Watskin. This world is going to be just fine, I promise. Tears filled her eyes, and I turned away before they started to fall, and strode into the portal. I felt myself rushing across the world. Like the portals left behind by the Jinn, this new design wasn't quite instant, but there was none of the discomfort. I experienced a blue flash, then the vaguest impression of rushing landscape, and then I was stepping out of a hovering portal over a wide, rune-etched circle. The air was much colder here, and I experienced a brief moment of vertigo as the enclosed hall of Lodenhold became climbing, jagged mountains all around and, above them, the open wound. A piece of land broke away, falling in a fiery ball far to the west somewhere. An expansive but utilitarian encampment spread out around us. Alacrian mages of all descriptions were coming out of buildings, hurrying up the primary road, and gathering around Saris. Some eyed the rest of us warily while others curiously began to walk circles around the exoforms, exclaiming in wonder at what must have been, to them, a very strange sight. In all, there seemed to be 3, perhaps 400 mages. Free Alacrians, Saris said, her voice echoing effortlessly around the encampment. The time has come to assail Agrona's fortress, the heart of his power in Alacria. Each of you has worked tirelessly since before the fall of Sovereign Orlith Vritra to secure a future for Alacria free of the Vritra clan's authoritarian regime. Now, together, we will fulfill the promise we made ourselves when this revolution began. There were some cheers in response, and Saris continued speaking, but my attention turned to one specific figure among the hundreds. Kara bypassed the crowd gathering around Saris and moved straight for the rest of us. Her brows knit tonight as she looked at me, but someone bumped me aside, and Chul hurried to her, wrapped her in a crushing hug, and lifted her off the ground. Lady Kara, he said with a laugh, shaking her like a child with a stuffed bear. It is excellent to see you, and I find myself very glad to fight alongside you again, even if you must feel quite awkward to be in the presence of my brother Arthur and his lady love, this fair elven princess here. Everyone within earshot froze. Regis, halfway manifested out of my body as he, too, went to greet Kara, sighed, completed his transformation, and then nipped Chul's hand hard enough to draw blood. Ah, you devilish beast, what have you done this for? Chul grumbled, immediately distracted as he lunged for Regis, who dodged away, flashing in and out of corporeality so that he became impossible for the phoenix to grab. Rubbing the back of my neck and feeling clad in an aura of pure awkwardness, I approached Kara. Sorry. She crossed her arms beneath her chest and gave me a wry look. What kind of stories have you been telling him about our time ascending together? Tessia walked up and gave me a similar expression. Ascending together, huh, is this some kind of Alacrian slang I'm not familiar with? I decided that the wisest course of action was to remain very still and silent. Both women began to laugh as Tessia slipped an arm through Kara's. I don't think I ever saw this side of him, Kara said, tossing her navy hair. Ascender Grey, as I knew him, was the most serious, brooding man I ever met. Funny how even here, at the very precipice, looking upon the literal end of the world, you seem better now, Arthur Lewin. More, yourself. I cleared my throat. I learned a lot about who I wanted to be by pretending to be the person I once was. From the corner of my eye, I caught Saris motioning to me. Time to go. I approached and stood between her and Silred as hundreds of Alacrian soldiers looked on. I've provided all the necessary instruction, Saris said quietly, but had hoped you would say a few words as well. I nodded and looked out at the small army. You know who I am. Many of you may have even seen me before. You knew me as Ascender Grey, and now as Arthur Lewin. I am not an Alacrian, but I have spent time among you, trained your students, a cheer went up from somewhere in the crowd, fought for your people. We may be from two separate continents, but our lived experience is not so far separated as the lands we were born upon. We have unity of purpose in the elimination of evil that threatens your families, your bloods, just as much as my own. The Vritra clan has offered you nothing but subjugation and brutality, no different than Decaden. You are all here today because you believe that Alacria can be a better place. My voice softened, but the mountain valley was so silent my voice carried easily to everyone regardless. And you were right. This continent is yours, so long as you'll fight for it. A soldier near the front lines began to slam his spear into his shield rhythmically, and the warrior beside him kept time by hammering the butt of his huge warhammer against the ground. Soon, the entire army was stamping their feet or clashing their weapons. Silred stepped aside and pointed toward the mountain pass with his sword. To Tegrin Kylum, for Alacria, someone shouted in the ranks. The cry was picked up, and the army began to march swiftly down the rough trail. As I stood by to watch, Chul jogged back to my side. Must we really move on foot to accommodate these soldiers? A long march through the mountains would be completed in only an hour if we flew ahead. One more necessary delay, I muttered. But the last one, I hope. Silred moved at the front of the ranks, but Saris stepped aside to join me. Our sentries confirm the road is clear from here to Tegrin Kylum, but there is a sizable encampment set up just beyond the range of whatever power has been protecting the fortress. We should expect resistance. The lances stood near the receiving platform with the 10 exoform pilots. They had watched warily as Saris gathered all these Alacrian mages around herself and listened to our speeches. Now, Veray stepped forward. Sentries aside, we three will scout ahead throughout the journey, Arthur. I nodded, and Veray, Byron, and Micah all flew into the air and started out ahead of us. Saris fell in beside her ranks, walking with the soldiers who had decided to fight Agrona for her. I gave the order for the exoforms to take up the rear. I will watch from above, Chul grunted, scowling as a small meteor of Ephiotan landmass impacted the mountains several miles to the west. He then flew up into the air and hovered a couple hundred feet above the advancing army. I spent the first part of the journey at the back of the line. Claire and I fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. She'd learned much about the Alacrian's style of fighting during her training, but there were significant holes in it. Over the next couple of hours, I gave her a crash course in fighting beside and against their battle groups. When we were done, I headed to the front of the line, where Saris, Kara, and Silred were leading, and thought I would educate them on the best use of the exoforms. Saris only quirked one corner of her mouth wryly at me. What do you think I did during my time in Vildoriel, after Agrona's attack searching for you? I think you will find I know quite as much about your beast machines as you do, Arthur, maybe even more. After that, I took to cycling through positions, flying forward to check on the lances, falling back to help Chul blast any chunks of Ephiotus that fell too close to us out of the air, marching with the soldiers, who were eager to hear more about my ascents or to relive my fights at the Victoriade, or to walk with Tessia and Sylvie, going over what Tess could remember from her time in Tegrin Kylum. We kept up a good pace, but still, it was a long march through difficult terrain. Above us, the wound seemed to grow inch by inch, tearing ever wider. I could only hope that the people of both continents were being protected as best they could be. In all, it took 12 full hours, although the journey would have been twice as long had every soldier among us not been a hardened fighter and mage. We caught our first glimpse of Tigran Kylum in the distance 2 full hours before we reached its outskirts. It was lit by the glow of Epheotis through the wound, which bathed the Basilisk Fang Mountains in golden light as if our own sun hadn't already set. The silhouette of dark spires and towers clawed their way out of the mountainside and reached up into the bright night sky toward the wound. It wasn't until we rounded a sharp bend in the winding path, though, just beneath the fortress, that we saw the Loyalist encampment. Crowded into a narrow ravine along the rough mountain path, several hundred tents and small structures had been erected. Fires dotted the encampment, and thousands of figures milled around within it. We were moving with our mana signatures, for those that had them, retracted as much as possible, but with so many eyes in the camp, it was only moments before someone saw us. A flare of mana went up, casting flickering red light across the mountainside, and suddenly people were rushing into haphazard formations. "Continue forward," Saris ordered, her voice carrying back down the line. I waved for Chul, Sylvie, the lances, who had fallen back to the main force as we approached Tigran Kylum, and the others to stay with the column, and Saris and I flew forward. When we were within a few hundred feet of the forward-most line of opposition, several shields flickered into existence to bar our path. Saris looked to me. "People of Alakria," I said, projecting my voice outward on an edge of etheric intent. "Stand down and let us pass. We are proceeding to Tigran Kylum in order to—" "Oh, we know why you're here," a man's voice boomed in response. A tall man with one horn stepped out of the lines of Alacrian mages. He had a beakish nose and unkempt black hair that hid the stump where his second horn used to be. His most distinctive feature, however, was his mismatched eyes, one a muddy brown, the other a bright scarlet that shone even across the distance. From somewhere behind me, I heard, "Ah, my brother in heterochromia," followed instantly by, "Not now, Uber," from Regis. "Wolfram," Saris said, her voice cold. "Still you scurry underfoot the Vritra, even as they continue to perish one by one. How unfortunate. You would have been better served by staying loyal to my cause instead of putting your faith in Dragoth. My condolences, of course. I heard the unfortunate news about my compatriot, your leash holder." Wolfram sneered. "You won't go any farther," Saris unblooded. "We are prepared to defend our high sovereign, and we are 10 to your 1. My brows rose. "I can barely sense enough mana from your encampment to conjure these shields in front of you. You're depleted from the recent pulse. Don't be stupid. You don't have to die here for nothing." Wolfram laughed. A few of the loyalist mages joined him, and then a few more, and then suddenly their entire encampment rang with mirth. As if someone had pulled aside a curtain, their mana signatures blazed, each at their full strength. "The High Sovereign has prepared us for your arrival," Wolfrun said, his laugh carrying through his words. Then, his face twisted into a snarl. "All loyal Alacrians, destroy the High Sovereign's enemies, and be rewarded with incredible power in the world he'll build atop their bones." The shields fell, and hundreds of spells began to pour from the enemy camp. 515. Arthur Leywin. I clenched my fists as I focused on my new god rune. 30 feet in front of us, at the same point demarcated by the opposing Alacrian army's previously conjured shields, space hardened. 1,000 spells, sickly green jets of acid, dark motes of void wind, winged summons of blue fire, struck the impassable space and ruptured, a chaotic entanglement of combusting magic like a badly timed firework display. Light oozed through the hardened space in a slow trickle, so that the sound of the impacts reached us before the visual cues. The loyalist Alacrian army appeared frozen on the other side, stunned. "Arthur, focus on Tigran Kylum," Saris shouted. "We will take care of the army." With 2 fingers, she gestured forward, and a volley of spells fired in return, though far fewer in number. I released the condensed plane of manipulated space, knowing that, on the other side, it would seem as if time leapt forward as 100 spells manifested out of nowhere. A wall of shields appeared just before the loyalist front line, wheels of fire, translucent panels of mana, rectangular blocks of stone like tower shields, among dozens of other unique implementations of their shields' runes. I activated King's Gambit and Realmheart, summoned my armor, which feathered across my body in an instant, then flew up toward the barrier wrapped around the entire fortress. As Realmheart took effect, a shimmering bubble of pure mana particles, invisible to the naked eye, came into view. It emanated from the ground just beyond the loyalist encampment. I could sense that it carved its way underground as well, enclosing all of Tigran Kylum in an egg-shaped field. Dark moats clung to the pure mana, basilisk decay-type magic, hidden within the barrier. One could walk right through it without realizing, only to end up dead a few seconds later. King's Gambit began to unfold the various options at my disposal even as I kept an eye on the battle progressing below. Tendrils of dark mana flew with our army's initial volley, and wherever they touched the Loyalists' defensive barricade, the shields collapsed. Dozens of our spells slipped through, landing among the defenseless Loyalists with screams of pain and shouted orders. Strikers from both sides were surging forward, but although our forces were vastly outnumbered, Chull and Regis led the charge. Flames wrapped around Chull, and he leapt in a spinning maneuver that sent flames out from himself in a wide arc. Shields flickered around the charging strikers but shattered just as quickly, and in an instant, dozens of warriors were immolated, collapsing the Loyalists' front line. They barely had time to acknowledge this crushing blow to their numbers before Regis set upon them. In his shadow wolf form, Regis suddenly became ethereal, his entire body taking on the texture and transparency of the smoky flames of his mane. His incorporeal body divided, separating first into 2, then 4, then 8 identical copies of himself. Each copy erupted in destruction as it passed into the lines of strikers, running through conjured shields and into the oncoming bodies. Each mage touched by Regis's destructive form was devoured by the amethyst flames. A dozen men fell, then 2, and within seconds, 100 or more Loyalists had been unmade by destruction. The disparate, smoky forms of Regis wavered before all snapping back together into one, but the damage was done. The strikers broke, their lines shattered, and hundreds of soldiers turned to run away individually instead of continuing forward as a cohesive unit. Their supporting shields and casters struggled to cover their retreat as more spells followed from our forces, our own strikers rushing to catch up. While one part of my mind tracked the action below, the bulk of my consciousness was bent on understanding and dissecting Agrona's barrier. The most immediate possibility was to simply step beyond it, right to the front doors of Tigran Kylum, but as I looked deeper into the occluded space beyond the barrier, I realized the deadly aura was not simply a shell, but the same motes of decay-type magic clung to all the atmospheric mana inside as well. I could, perhaps, push through it undeterred, but I wouldn't risk any of my companions without knowing more about it. Next, I considered my new godrune. Over the last few days, I had come to understand and think about it only as the Spatium godrune. I envisioned tunneling through the barrier, creating a safe space for my companions and I to travel through. But, though the Spatium godrune itself represented manifested insight, I hadn't had time to experiment with it extensively, and I couldn't be certain Agrona's spell would be affected by a manipulation of the space itself, nor that I could control an extra-dimensional space that would allow my companions to pass through. Perhaps I could make a pocket dimension and move it around us as we passed through this death field. Directly below me, a fleeing striker passed beyond the barrier. He traveled only 2 steps before his body stiffened, his eyes rolled up toward the sky, and he slammed to the ground, dead. Reform ranks. The one-horned Vritra blood was shouting. A rain of spells from the casters was falling down on our own strikers and casters, while the limited number of our shields attempted to block them. Spiraling dark voids and expansive panels of ice supplemented these shields, however, as Saris and Varay focused on defending our soldiers. Lightning and stones crashed among the Loyalist army's back lines from where Micah and Byron had moved around the mountainside, flanking the encampment. A small core of Loyalist battle groups, seemingly more organized and synergizing better than many of the others, moved forward to meet the 10 exoforms. A wall of translucent panels sprang up, flickering rapidly to allow spells from their casters to fly through. Claire led the charge, her blazing, fire salt-edged blade sparking and hissing as it impacted the overlapping shields. They collapsed, and she burst through, falling on 2 surprised strikers. I felt a thrum of small, vindictive pleasure at watching the 9 non-mages, led by a young woman whose core had been destroyed, disassemble the well-organized battle groups in a moment. Spells rolled off the mana shrouding the exoform, and once its griffin-like form was through the front lines, there was little the casters or shields could do to slow it. Spell cancellation was the next avenue I considered for removing the shroud of death that hung around Tigran Kylum. Tendrils of purified ether released from my core and out my channels, tentatively probing Agrona's barrier. The decay-type field pressed back against the ether, condensing around it. I sought out where the black motes were bound to the purified mana, wedging ether between them like a pry bar. The spell fought back, the decay clinging to the mana as it rolled like oil around my efforts to separate it. I pressed with a second, then third tendril, attacking it from multiple directions, simultaneously wedging, prying, and pulling, even as I realized that, if it took this much effort to unbind a single particle, it would be a pointless effort even if I succeeded. As if giving way in recognition of my understanding, the decay-type mode of mana slipped free of the bond. The particle of pure mana was spit out of the bearer, but a bright green mode of wind attribute atmospheric mana flowed in to fill the void, and the unseated piece of decay grabbed a hold of it like a virus. I frowned, following the many competing and entwined threads of King's Gambit toward my next attempt to undo the spell. Below me, the battle was well in hand. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, there was little the Alacrian forces could do against the combined efforts of Chul, Sylvie, Saris, Silret, and the Lances. The Alacrians simply did not have the force necessary to combat such power, and it was only a matter of time before they gave up or died to a man. Even as this thought flickered across a disengaged corner of my mind, a horrible crack split the air like a thunderbolt. The cliff faces to both sides rippled with mana, and the solid stone began to disintegrate, moving like sand as it collapsed. Suddenly the bulk of our army was in the path of twin landslides cascading down into the valley. I instinctively finched in that direction, but an instant later, Veray and Micah were already casting their own spells. On one side of the valley, the stone hardened, fusing back into the side of the mountain, its momentum ceasing suddenly. An unnatural, flowing shelf of rock was left behind. Opposite of it, great buttresses of ice rushed to meet the avalanche, catching and pressing it back against the mountainside as a new iceberg was formed, freezing tumbling rocks and sloughing sheets of stone together into a single, motionless, gleaming tableau. In the hollow spaces left behind by the rockslides, two twin, opaque portals gleamed with menace, like two thunderous eyes glaring down from the cliffs. I had only enough time to acknowledge their existence before creatures began to stumble out of them. A handful of twisted, fused together monstrosities. Of exposed sinew, mummified flesh, and grafted weapons chittered out torn throat, gurgling noises as they flinched away from the sun, their misshapen faces panning jumpily. Within a couple of seconds, they spotted the armies below them. The reaction was immediate. A hateful bellow issued from one and was answered by the rest. Then the chimeras, the very same from the first relictum's zone I had ever discovered, were sprinting down the mountainside with wild abandon. I hesitated, my striated consciousness momentarily slipping back into alignment as all of my disparate thoughts focused on those two portals. Had they been there all the time, or was this some new trap prepared by Agrona for our arrival? Did they enter directly into the relictums, or had Agrona been recreating the creatures outside of the relictums? I acknowledge the importance of this distinction with a certain amount of dread. My hesitation continued as Silret flashed into the middle of the chimeras, his blade perfectly bypassing their meager defenses to flay grotesque flesh and bone. They tumbled lifelessly past him down the mountainside, their broken bodies shattering to pieces. And yet, above, more were already clawing their way from the portal. Across the valley, dark shapes emerged from the twin portal at the same time. These winged forms had thin legs and bulbous bodies, long necks, and spear-like beaks. Unlike the chimera's mindless bellows, a dozen spear beaks immediately leapt into the air, whirled around, and lobbed poisoned weapons down upon our army. In a single motion, I conjured my blade and swept it from right to left through a dozen individual points revealed by God's step. The blade reappeared to carve through each of the attackers, and all 12 of them cried out and plummeted from the sky. Our forces were now facing enemies on 3 sides, and there was no way to be sure how many or for how long enemies could pour from the twin portals. Saris was already recalling the forward strikers as she and Veray focused on protecting the fighting force. Chul continued to wade through the loyalist army with Regis, while Silret and Byron each took a portal, hacking through the monsters that continued to appear. I looked back at Tagrin Kylam, teeth gritted in frustration. If I got bogged down fighting here. Sylvie, who should have been supporting the others, was floating slowly toward me. A few stray spells targeted her, but she batted them away effortlessly. There was something strange in the cadence of her progression, as if she'd forgotten where she was or what she was supposed to be doing. Sylv, I sent, projecting her name questioningly. She didn't answer until she was close enough to speak. Hello, Arthur. Her eyes flashed ruby red. I let out a bitter, huffing scoff. Agrona, lovely day for a battle, isn't it? The words, though they came from Sylvie's lips, sounded nothing like her. The wry quirk of her lips, the awkward way in which she hung in the air, all spoke to the truth. She was no longer piloting her own physical body. I'm glad to see my little barrier has proven an interesting challenge for you. GA and I have had ever so much fun considering ways to counter your various abilities. Sylvia Grona chuckled. She thinks very highly of you, Ga. And I suppose her esteem isn't without reason. You've proven to be far more competent and interesting than I'd originally expected. I wonder what might have happened had I accepted your surrender back then, as the war came crashing down around you. Hubris, Arthur. It is inevitably a painful downfall of my kind. Thankfully, each time I begin succumbing to it, someone like you comes along to remind me of my own fallibility. What do you want, Agrona? I asked, my mind racing as I considered ways to break Sylvie free of his control. I'd been so certain that her resurrection had removed his ability to take over her body from a distance. Sylvie Agrona laughed, a cruel sound that I found disorienting coming from my bond. To talk, obviously, I felt as if this form would be better suited to the task. In person, it seems you would be likely to shoot first and ask questions later, as I believe the expression goes. My eyes skated past Sylvie's form to the battlefield below, but Sylvie Agrona dipped down, face bright and manic. Oh ho, no getting distracted. She rotated around me, putting her back right up to the deadly barrier. Let your friends do what you brought them to do. Fight, die, be the fodder you see them as. I don't, I cut myself off, refusing to be manipulated by his taunts. With Realmheart and King's Gambit active, I followed the progress of the battle below with my other senses, even though I was forced to turn my back to the battlefield. The crown looks good on you, Art my boy, Sylvie Agrona continued, as if in recognition of my own thoughts. You just can't escape it, can you? That urge to be in control. To be king. She laughed again. You carry it from life to life in the same way the legacy carried her potential. That was quite the trick, by the way, severing Cecilia from the legacy. Sylvie Agrona's eyes darkened. How'd you manage that? Agrona's words stirred a thought inside me. I let myself relax and my eyes go unfocused as I looked for the golden threads that I knew connected Sylvie to all those whose lives entwined with her own, including Agrona. But the connection to fate wasn't there. Instead, I sent a quick command to Regis. I'm glad you asked. Your continued ignorance is more than I had dared hope for, I answered firmly. No matter what you do, the power of the legacy is beyond your reach. Sylvie Agrona looked up at the wound, brows raised in a question. Maybe, but you should not speak so confidently when you've still seen so little. The universe is very large, Arthur Lewin, and there are oh so many ways to skin a cat. A scream punctuated the battlefield as I sensed the chimeras, numerous enough that Silrit's blade couldn't find them all, crash into our Alacrian forces. I started to look, and Sylvie Agrona drifted backwards, breaking the plane of the decay field. My fist snapped out, grabbing Sylvie by the front of her black-scaled armor and yanking her back out of the barrier. My face twisted into a wrathful grimace. Enough, Agrona, your daughter is not a bargaining chip, or an experiment, or... A grotesque grin spread across Sylvie Agrona's face. My daughter. You said the key words yourself, Artie. I think, between the two of us, what Sylvie is or isn't will be up to me to decide. But I owe you my thanks for keeping her well fed and cared for up until now. And, of course, for bringing her so close. My eyes widened as a pulse of ether rippled out from her. My own ether crashed back against it, attempting to hold her Avum abilities in check, but in the moment in between, Sylvie Agrona wrenched free of my grip and threw herself into the decay field, her arms flailing and legs kicking as if she were swimming through the air toward Tegrin Kylum. The time stop shattered, and Regis, already rushing toward Sylvie at my earlier command, shot past me, through the barrier, and into the decay field behind her. God's step flared, and I plunged into the etheric pathways, appearing next to Sylvie. Black liquid was already leaking from her nose and eyes as she grinned. I grabbed her just as Regis shot into her body. Gee gotcha, Sylvie Agrona croaked, spitting up black bile over pale lips. Tens of thousands of dark motes struck me simultaneously from every direction. My core burned as it pumped ether to my skin, reinforcing the layer that always clad my body against the impact. My concentration slipped, and all my god runes went dark. Sylvie Agrona's fingers clenched around my throat as she laughed. I struggled to find God's step, to pull us both beyond the edges of the spell, but I couldn't grasp it. My skin was aflame, the black motes burrowing into every inch of me, Sylvie Agrona's laughter like a saw blade behind my eyes. Hold on, princess, Regis's voice fought through the pain and disorientation. I realized the world had gone dark, and I could feel it spinning, spinning, spinning. A gasp, fluttering light. Sylvie's face, smeared with inky slime, eyes clear, expression pure desperation. Violet flames dancing from her skin. Destruction. She was burning from within. We were falling. Arthur! Sylvie screamed, her voice piercing my ears and my mind at the same time. Black motes writhed across my skin, burrowing between the scales and joints of my armor, through my ether, and into my flesh. I could feel them clogging my ether channels and scrabbling at the gates forged in my ether core. The purified ether within me fought to purge the attacking decay, but unlike straightforward wounds, it seemed to struggle. It was as if the motes were driven by a consciousness that encouraged them deeper and deeper into my body. Sylvie took my weight as we struck the ground hard enough to buckle her knees. Where she touched me, destruction ate away my armor and body, and she quickly released me. Regis, go to Arthur. She ordered, pointing down at me. Use destruction to burn away the decay. I attempted to stand, but pain racked my body so intensely that the world went black, then white, and I came to once again on my back. I can't, Regis exclaimed in our linked minds. Destruction is the only thing holding Agrona and this fucking decay field at bay. You'll die, or turn against us. Sylvie knelt beside me, her hands outstretched as if she wanted to touch me but was holding herself back. I'm sorry, Arthur, but this is going to hurt. Then, she grabbed me. Destruction again devoured flesh, armor, ether, whatever it could. Sylvie began to drag me across the rough ground, back toward the sounds of fighting and explosions of mana. She held me gingerly, first by the pauldron of my armor, but when that was gone, by my arm. We were halfway when destruction had taken more of the arm than the tissue could manage, and the arm came apart in her hands. My bond screamed in fury and heartbreak as she switched to my other arm. We moved another 100 feet, then stopped. I felt something coming closer and, despite the agony, twisted my head around to look. A writhing orb of dark light approached through the gloom. The golden light of the wound was dimmed within the decay field, and two forms of darkness snapped and bit at each other around the orb. Within it, I could just make out the shadow of a silhouette. Sylvie released me, pulling her destruction-wreathed hands away from my disintegrating flesh. Then the orb wrapped around us. At its center, Saris looked down at me. A thin sheen of perspiration gleamed on her brow, but she appeared otherwise unharmed by the ongoing battle. A hook set with bait, a trap sprung, she muttered, staring into and through me. I couldn't manage a response, my jaw locked tight in a rictus of pain. The scene around me faded in and out in red and black waves. Hands pressed against my cheeks. I stared up into Saris's face. I had no thoughts. Everything but the barren edge of my senses was locked behind pain. In my eyes, dark light. In my skin and blood and bones, cold void. I gasped. Saris pushed her void magic through me, alongside my own healing ether, and the decay-type mana was expelled in a sudden rush. It swarmed beyond the edges of her void shield. Balling like a fist, it crashed down against the shield, which quaked and began to crack. The swarm retreated, balling up again, gathering more dark motes to itself. I struggled to stand without working arms. With the invading decay expelled, I was already healing, but replacing a lost arm was not instant, even for me. Thanks, I said to Saris as I regarded Agrona's mana building toward another attack. I won't be able to hold against another blow like that. It's time to get out of here, Arthur, Saris said firmly. Time, I thought, the word resounding in my skull. I pulled, from my earlier musings, one of many ideas, potential ways in which to counter the decay field. But I had lacked the time to try them all. My King's Gambit enhanced thoughts moved far faster than my physical form ever could. Sylvie, can you give us time? Through the aura of destruction, she gave a single nod and uncertain shrug at the same time. I will try. With my body back under my control, I reached for Aroa's Requiem. Time. Violet motes began to emanate from my flesh and roll down my arms. They jumped and danced like little bugs of my own. I forced more ether into the godrune, and the motes continued to appear, continued to build upon my skin. Outside, the dark sparks of decay moved as if the air itself were viscous. The consistent battle between Saris's void magic and Agrona's decay field was waged in slow motion. Saris herself seemed frozen, her body a lifelike statue. Already, Sylvie's eyes were narrowed as she struggled. He's fighting back, she groaned through bared teeth. I was running out of time, but I knew I would need every prolonged second, every single particle of ether. My entire form seemed alive with the motes conjured by Aroa's Requiem, like I was a dropped piece of meat covered in ants. Sylvie gasped, and I sensed her Avum ability quake. I stepped out of Saris's protective bubble, directly into the line of attack. Time snapped back into motion, and the thrumming cluster of decay slammed down around me. Like a wave, it simultaneously struck and broke, the particles swarming around me, again trying to push their way inside me, to clog my own biology and rip me to pieces from within. But they impacted the barrier formed by Aroa's Requiem first. Wherever the dark particles of decay impacted a bright amethyst mote, they were scrubbed clean. That essence of decay, the mechanism by which a basilisk housed and purified mana through their core, imbuing it with their natural affinity with the decay attribute, was cleansed. What else is decay, if not the act of decomposition over time? I laughed as I watched the process work. Each Aroa's Requiem particle leapt on a dark fleck of decay attribute mana, reversing the decay until a bright, colorful particle of water, earth, air, or fire remained. In moments, the attacking swarm dissolved into nothing but a dense cloud of atmospheric mana around me. But the decay field remained. I thrust my hands outward, willing Aroa's Requiem to reach into the air. The darting violet motes took flight, attacking the decay, breaking its bonds, and reverting it back to its natural form. The decay field popped like a bubble, and the remaining decay attribute mana was retracted back into Tegrin Kylum. The path forward was clear. As the violet sparks of Aroa's Requiem returned to me, I felt my insight deepening, cascading layers of new understanding into the nature of progression, decay, entropy, and rejuvenation overlaying my initially limited insight into the Godrune. My fingers twitched, and all that energy jumped to Sylvie. Reading my intention, Regis doused the flames still cladding her foreman. Hopped out of her body. Aroa's Requiem hesitated at the barrier of her flesh. Sylvie, of course, knew exactly what I was doing, and so she embraced it. Aroa's Requiem sank into her skin, the particles searching through her body in much the same way I'd done with the lances when releasing them from Keshus's bond on their cores. The curse laid on Sylvie by Agrona was much deeper, but my understanding of Aroa's Requiem now was much greater. In moments, I had scoured away the dark mark inside her mind at the base of her skull, a piece of Agrona's magic implanted there when she'd been only an egg. I had to give it to him. Inventing a piece of magic that subsisted beyond even her death and resurrection was an impressive feat, and it had very nearly been my undoing. I looked up at Tegrin Kylum. Not out of tricks just yet, are you, Agrona? It's gone, Sylvie said, rubbing at the base of her skull. We're certain, this time. I nodded. He'll never control you again, I promise it. My Bond's eyes shone fiercely, angry tears building in the corners. She wiped the dark ichor from her lips and nodded in understanding. Despite the weight of the moment, I could not give it the time it deserved. While I'd been struggling against Agrona's trap, the battle had continued in the valley behind us. Despite the appearance of the Relictum's beasts, it seemed as though things were under control. I hesitated to take the next step, but this battle was a distraction. Our real target was still inside. Projecting my voice through my own etheric aura so it rang out across the battlefield, I gave the command to progress to the next phase of the battle. The lances broke away from their positions, flying in my direction with Tessia safeguarded between them. Ceres returned to the fight, helping Silrit to hold back the tide of creatures still spilling out of the Relictums. Sensing Chul begin to follow them, I led the way up toward the closest of many balconies that protruded from the sheer walls. Ether built in my fist until I reached it, then released as an etheric blast. The glass front exploded inward, the mana warding and hardening it unable to hold up against the force. I strode into what appeared to be a small office. It was sparsely decorated and seemed to have been ransacked at some point. The rubble of my entrance did little to improve it. Stepping aside so that Sylvie and Regis could enter, I waited for the rest. Tessia would be our guide through the fortress. I couldn't sense Agrona's mana signature, but I knew he was here. The lances alighted on the balcony with Tessia, and the four stepped in, looking around. So, this is where the dark god rests his head at night, huh? Micah said, kicking away a splintered shelf that had fallen from the wall. She nudged Byron and grinned. I expected a stronger smell of manure. Veray's cool gaze flicked to Micah before returning to the room. Riley, she said, eyes open, Lance Omrecker. You can still step in it, even if it doesn't stink. Tessia ran her fingers through the dust that had settled on the desktop. This must belong to one of his researchers. We're quite a ways from his private wing, but, her voice cut off with a sharp gasp as several mana signatures suddenly appeared throughout the battlefield below. I spun, flying out through the shattered entrance I'd made. Below, a large hunk of metal was skipping across the hard stone of the valley floor, sparks and slate-gray feathers flying with each impact. Chasing the gray blur was a man with gray skin, blood-red eyes, and spiraling horns. He drew back a long glaive, ready to strike. In an instant, I made out not only this single wraith, but 5 others scattered throughout the battlefield. Chul had reversed course, diving back down into the battle. As I tensed to fly after Claire and Chul, Mana lurched behind me. Stomach clenching painfully, my head jerked around as the office's interior door began to unfold, the space suddenly not space, but 10,000 crystalline shards that rolled over and past each other like a curtain of glass. I recognized the sight immediately. Each entrance into the Relictum's ruins had been guarded by an identical portal. As I hovered frozen between the portal and the attacking wraiths, suddenly the curtain rolled forward, the crystals wiping away the room and absorbing everything they touched. It was fast, far too fast. Tessia, standing only a few feet away, barely had time to stumble, eyes flaring, before the crystals were wrapping around her. The Spatium Godrune activated. Reaching down, I condensed the space between Claire and myself, pulling her away from the wraith even as I lunged toward Tessia's outstretched arm as the rest of her vanished inside the crystalline curtain. The walls around the crystals were transforming, rippling, pushing out from the fortress itself. No, more like new walls were forming and extending outward, as if a second structure were merging with Tegrin Kylum, or being born from it. My fingers wrapped around Tessia's hand, and she screamed as if she were being pulled in two. Claire's griffin-like exoform skid across the floor toward me. Micah, who had been closest to the balcony, flailed as she sped backwards out of the shattered wall. Veray, too close to the expanding portal, turned as if in slow motion to push Byron back, but he was lunging forward, attempting to pull her away. The portal rushed across the room, the purple-veined stonework melting into reality as if from nowhere. I can't pull her back out, I thought to my companions, letting Tessia's fingers slip through mine as she disappeared into what could only be the Relictums. Without hesitating, I stepped in after her. The crystalline curtain parted easily,